Okay, we turn to Group 24, Housing Availability. I call Amendment 112 in the name of Ariane Burgess. Group with other amendments as shown in the groupings. Ariane Burgess to move Amendment 112 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ms Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I move Amendment 112. For 2 decades, the co-housing sector has been told by politicians that they are supportive of the model, and yet no significant progress has been made. Amendment 112 requires the Scottish Government to produce guidance on co-housing. Specifically, it gives ministers the option of developing definitions, outlining how the model could develop, and setting out how the public sector should support co-housing. I wish to underline the fact that there is no obligation around what must be included in the guidance. The only obligations are that the guidance must be published within 2 years and that it must be drafted in collaboration with the relevant stakeholders. And this provides ministers with plenty of flexibility. The Scottish Government must be active in facilitating this model of housing. The current pace of change has been too slow and has threatened to kill off the co-housing model before it can get started. Now, this is despite the Government's having a policy aim to increase co-housing in Scotland and there being a significant amount of support for the model from engaged, passionate communities who wish to build homes that suit their needs. We need better understanding and support for co-housing in the public sector, understanding that in that model everyone has their own home and then together share some common facilities, which might be a laundry facility, a common room or a workshop. These facilities build community and a culture of looking out for one another rather than after one another. Co-housing projects struggle to get access to public funding at all levels, leaving them stranded at the planning stage. And they also get bounced between councils and public bodies that don't know what to do with them. And this means that the wide variety of public goods the model offers are being lost. One specific public good is that we do have a prevention agenda, and something that co-housing is known for is that people become immersed in an experience of well-being that then can lead to a sense of a community that removes the isolation that many people experience. I also think that some co-housing is intergenerational, and in that case, that can provide an experience of younger people engaging with older people, something that we desperately need in our society today. So a fully functioning co-housing sector would deliver significant cost benefit. And we cannot continue to make promises that aren't being kept, particularly when taking action would be of the significant benefit to communities and those with specific housing needs. And that is why it's crucial that this amendment is written into legislation.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call Mark Griffin to speak to Amendment 366 and other amendments in the group. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The amendments in my name in this group relate to the declaration of a housing emergency, and I want to start by acknowledging that the Government has now accepted the principle of these amendments, which were agreed at stage 2, and has provided me with these technical changes to address some of the finer details. I think it's important that we do get this right, and I welcome the Government's willingness to work constructively to ensure that this legislation is robust, and I look forward to seeing how ministers will now put these provisions into practice and demonstrate leadership in tackling Scotland's housing emergency. It seems like for years now that I have been raising concerns about the growing crisis in housing, long before Parliament or Government came to formally recognise it as an emergency. But when the declaration finally came, it was a necessary first step, but the obvious next step is action beyond that declaration. What matters is what happens next. Now, despite the volume of legislation, amendments and scrutiny this bill has received, there does remain, to me, a glaring absence of measures within this bill that will actually increase the supply of homes for the hundreds of thousands of people in need. My intention with these amendments has always been to ensure that future governments can't simply sidestep responsibility for the scale of homelessness and housing need that we see in Scotland. That declaring an emergency must be more than a headline. It must come with a duty to act and to be held accountable for delivering real change. A housing emergency is not something that can be brushed aside when the news cycle moves on. It's a daily reality for thousands of families and children who deserve better, and that's why it's so important that this bill now places responsibility for action squarely on whatever the government of the day is. I'm pleased that the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee supported this approach, and I now ask Parliament to agree to these technical changes to the amendments that were passed at stage 2. Let's ensure that going forward, any government faced with a housing emergency is required to set out clearly what it will do to end it and is judged on its actions and not just its words. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Griffin. And I call Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 255 and other amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard criticisms that this bill doesn't do enough to increase the supply of homes, and in many ways I agree. My amendments 21, 255, 256 and associated consequentials seek to address this. The Scottish Vacant and Derelict Land Survey 2023 showed that we have over 9,000 hectares of derelict and vacant land in Scotland. That's the size of around 18,000 football pitches. Roughly two-thirds of vacant and derelict land, if it is eventually brought into use, is used for residential housing. And we also have many houses not in use. 31,596 homes have been empty for more than a year. We have a housing crisis. We have people living in unsuitable accommodation. We have local authorities suspending social housing allocations as they are needed for temporary accommodation. Yet we also have almost 32,000 homes that could be rented or sold for people to live in now. This has to change, and my amendments seek to do that. 256 would empower local authorities to order a property or land that has been left vacant for a specified period to be sold for housing or to be rented. It would also empower communities to tackle the blight of empty homes and derelict land, as community groups could apply to the local authority for an order. Compulsory sale and lease orders are not new ideas. England's empty dwelling management orders, which allow privately owned properties to be managed by local authorities, have been in place for around 20 years. The Scottish Land Commission published proposals in 2018, and the Scottish Government has been slow to act on those proposals. The manifesto on which the SNP was elected in 2021 says, and I quote, "We will strengthen compulsory purchase powers for local authorities and introduce new compulsory sale orders." Well, it's only 8 months to go before the next election, and there is still no legislation on the books other than this bill. If it's not going to happen in this bill, it's not going to happen within this term. The least the Scottish Government can do is to acknowledge that delay is by agreeing the general principle of compulsory sale and lease orders now and support my two amendments, in particular in this group, 255 and 256. They can then use 255 to review the compulsory purchase system, consult and then, if needed, bring secondary legislation early in the next Parliament in the powers provided by 256. Bringing a whole new bill will add more delay. It would also not be needed. The English empty dwelling orders did not need a standalone bill, with the powers being introduced in a general housing bill, just like what we have in front of us. And as we contemplate more delay, England is forging on. The UK Government backs reducing the threshold for EDMOs to 6 months, which Westminster Council says would help bring 11,000 homes into use. As with the 12-month ban on evictions being introduced south of the border, we risk Scotland falling behind. I'm very grateful to have had the support of Shelter Scotland for my amendments, and I'm not shying away from the fact that this is a technically and legally complicated area, and that's why I've left parts of it to secondary legislation. But given the need to boost housing supply, which all members agree is crucial, we should be using the bill to send a clear signal that we will no longer tolerate houses being empty when people are homeless. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Beginning with amendments 112, in the name of Ariane Burgess, requiring ministers to publish guidance on co-housing. This is identical to an amendment brought forward by Ariane Burgess at stage 2, which wasn't pressed at the time on the basis that we don't need a statutory obligation to publish guidance. Ministers can publish guidance on this issue without a statutory duty to do so. There was agreement at stage 2 that the government would do just that, and I reconfirm that commitment today. There's also a number of amendments in the name of Maggie Chapman relating to compulsory sale and lease powers. On Amendment 255, I'm very pleased to confirm to Ms Chapman that we published a consultation on the 19th of September on exactly this point, which ultimately makes the amendment obsolete. It has been fulfilled, and I'd ask her not to press it. Amendment 256 seeks to commit the ministers to introduce legislation within specific timeframes to give local authorities the power to require the owners of derelict land and buildings to offer for sale or let such land or buildings for use as residential housing, which is ultimately compulsory sale or lease. I'm very supportive of exploring these tools and the way that they could assist us in responding to the housing emergency, but ultimately it would be premature to commit to legislating for such powers whilst we await the results of the consultation, which, as I say, is currently underway, opened on the 19th of September. So with these issues in mind and the work already started, I'd ask Maggie Chapman not to press. Yes.
Maggie Chapman, briefly.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking my intervention. I understand that she says, the consultation has happened and it would be premature, but surely giving ministers the powers to act in the event that that consultation leads down a particular path requiring action, that will speed up the process in the future, meaning we don't have to wait for yet more primary legislation. This 256 is an enabling power. It isn't requiring you to do something. So you could use those powers in 256 dependent on what the consultation that you've launched says.
All through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I absolutely take the point, but I'm confident and comfortable that whatever the results of the consultation, which is currently ongoing, which is just opened, whatever it is, the Government will be able to find the appropriate legislative vehicle to implement whatever from that we decide is necessary. But to preempt that, I think, would be inappropriate. Amendment 21 and consequential 51 would go a bit of a step further from 256 and introduce a power for local authorities to order the compulsory sale or lease of property which has been vacant or derelict for a specific period. This is identical to an amendment at stage 2. I want to again reassure Maggie Chapman and the Parliament that we're committing to doing all we can to support the best use of land and property in Scotland, and I absolutely believe it should be used to provide high-quality housing. I'm also mindful of the potential usefulness of these measures. Indeed, that's why we, as I say, have delivered upon the commitment we made to consult by including various questions on both compulsory sale and lease orders in that consultation that was published on 19th of September. And until we have the results, the amendments are premature. Turning to Mr Griffin's amendments 366, 7 and 387, I've met with Mr Griffin on a number of occasions, and we have both agreed that tackling the housing emergency is of the utmost importance and that we must use the opportunity afforded us by the bill to drive this agenda forward. Although I would note that members should be cognisant that the Government published a Housing Emergency Action Plan on the 2nd of September, which will help us deliver around 8,000 affordable homes this year and 36,000 over the coming 4. That aside, I'm very grateful that Mr Griffin agreed to make revisions to Section 51F to ensure the provision is as impactful as possible in tackling the housing emergency, and therefore I would ask members to support his amendments 366, 367 and 387 and oppose the others in the group.
I call Graham Simpson briefly.
Thank you, and it will be brief. I just want to speak very briefly about the amendments from Maggie Chapman about compulsory sale orders, because this has been a frustration of many of us in this Parliament for many years. And I actually think the commitment from the SNP dates back to 2018. It may have even been earlier than that. So they committed to legislate for this. That was backed by parties across the chamber. But nothing's happened. So, I hear there's going to be a consultation. That's often government speak for kicking the can down the road. I hope that's not the case here. I hope it will actually lead to action, because it has to. We've got too many properties sitting empty in Scotland, so this has to lead to something.
I invite the Cabinet Secretary if there's anything further she wishes to add.
I would just add, Presiding Officer, the consultation's ongoing now. It's not to be started, it has started.
Thank you. I now invite Ariane Burgess to wind up. Press of withdrawal amendment 112. Ms Burgess.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Other European nations already support co-housing. Take Denmark, which has embedded the model within its housing culture. And this amendment brings forward, Amendment 112, brings forward a relatively small amount of work off the back of this, which could deliver a real difference. So I would urge the Chamber to back it. I brought this amendment back due to, in part, the change of Cabinet Secretary between Stage 2 and Stage 3, and also discussions with stakeholders who expressed frustration over the lack of action, which has led to mistrust. Support for a Scottish model of co-housing could unlock a powerful form of housing in Scotland. I also want to say that we will also be supporting the amendments from Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. Can you just confirm that you are pressing?
I'm pressing, yes.
The question is that Amendment 112 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is not agreed. There will be a division of members who cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. The result of the vote on Amendment 112 in the name of Ariane Burgess is yes 28, no 76. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 244 in the name of Jamie Harkle-Johnston, already debated with Amendment 3. Jamie Harkle-Johnston, to move or not move? The question is that Amendment 244 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division of members who cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Tim Eagle.
Is that on? Yeah. Sorry, Presiding Officer, my app wouldn't connect. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Eagle. I'll make sure that is recorded.
Request to speak from Kenneth Gibson.
Point of order, Kenneth Gibson.
Officer.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. I will ensure that is recorded. The result of the vote on Amendment 244 in the name of Jamie Hunker-Johnson is yes 38, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed, which takes us to Group 25, Accessibility of Housing. I call Amendment 351 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, grouped with Amendments 352, 368 and 369. Pam Duncan-Glancy to move Amendment 351 and speak to all amendments in the group. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Amendment 351 would require Scottish ministers no later than 2 years after this section comes into force to publish an accessible home standard. The Government said in Housing 2040 that they would develop and publish a new accessible home standard for all new homes. It hasn't yet been updated and hasn't been updated in over 20 years. They said that it would be implemented through changes to building standards. However, they've delayed that introduction. At stage 2, the Government said they couldn't support an amendment like this because drafted similarly because it was premature in advance of consideration of responses to its consultation carried out in 2023. However, for the 30,000 people across the country on waiting lists because they are disabled and need accessible housing, stuck in their own homes, this action is not premature, it is far too late. In Glasgow alone, there are currently nearly 5,000 people on the waiting list for a ground floor property or accessible accommodation. And with over 60 associations in Glasgow, I suspect this number will be higher. Disabled people and their representative organisations were actively consulted during the development of the Housing 2040 strategy, and they now rightly want to see change. More importantly, they need to see change. We cannot continue indefinitely without clarity on standards for new builds, standards to ensure we don't build more inaccessible homes, but instead get it right for our population. And the people who need them deserve that action. That's why I brought Amendment 351. Since I lodged the Amendment 351, the Cabinet Secretary has reached out to confirm that she supports the intention of it and the urgency that it pushes, but that she was unable to support it because of two technical issues. The use of the Building Safety Act 2022 definition of the new build home, which would mean the standards would apply only at the point of ownership but not construction, which is clearly not my intention. And the second reason, because there is a lack of a link to an enforcement mechanism such as the Scottish Building Standards system. Since the Cabinet Secretary drew these points to my attention, we worked together quite closely to develop a manuscript amendment that would have amended this in order to bring an amendment that the Cabinet Secretary and Parliament could have supported and that would have delivered the intention that I had set out in Amendment 351. However, the manuscript amendment had not been accepted, and so I was not able to press it. But in the spirit of collaboration, and I have to say to the Cabinet Secretary to thank you for the collaboration since this anomaly had been pointed out. I'm pleased that it is the Government's intention to set out this evening in the Chamber action that will be taken in order to deliver what the reformed amendment would have delivered, and indeed review the building standards within 2 years of royal assent of this piece of legislation. That is welcome news, and I look forward to the Cabinet Secretary confirming that when she speaks a little later in this particular discussion. Presiding Officer, accessible, adaptable homes enable people to thrive at every stage of their life. They reduce pressure on health and social care systems, empower older and disabled people to live with autonomy, and support working families by removing daily barriers to well-being. It's time action on this was taken, and I'm pleased that we should get commitments to that regard this evening. Amendment 352, Presiding Officer, in my name, is because we know that not everyone lives in a new home. Indeed, the majority of older and disabled people live in general needs housing that was never designed to meet changing needs. This puts an increasing pressure, of course, on Scotland's housing, health and social care system. Housing adaptations are a vital part of the solution to that. They are often the difference between staying at home and being forced into crisis. Yet, despite decades of research and recommendations, Scotland's adaptation system remains fragmented, reactive and under-resourced. Innovative work is happening, but too often help arrives only after a fall, injury or hospital stay, and access varies depending on where you live tenure and what funding is available. That's why I brought Amendment 352 in my name. It would require Scottish ministers to, by regulation, create a scheme to provide adaptations. The scheme would apply irrespective of tenure, integrate adaptations into planned repair, maintenance and upgrade programmes, include a mechanism for evaluating the adaptations made to inform future strategy and resource allocation, and ensure evaluation involves engagement with relevant organisations. The scheme is recommended in the recent What's Next for Adaptations report, led by the University of Stirling's Intersectional Stigma of Place-Based Ageing project. And the report notes that delays and inequalities in access to adaptations are widespread across Scotland, and the consequences are serious, with more falls, avoidable hospital admissions and missed opportunities for prevention. Presiding Officer, more than this, living in a home that isn't adapted has a profound impact on your life. And the Government know about the case for change in this area. The need is growing and the cost of inaction will mount. One of my constituents has recently contacted me to say that he's been in a situation where he's had to personally find resources for a stair climber because of outdated advice that has been given in the existing regime that suggests that common changes cannot be made to common areas because the risk to other tenants of not being able to have move their furniture up and down if a stair lift is in place is greater than the risk to that of his wife who has dementia and him pulling her up 4 storeys in a stair climber. This kind of example needs clarity and direction from the Government, and that is exactly the sort of thing my Amendment 352 was seeking to achieve, and I hope that it can garner cross-party support from the Chamber this evening. The need is growing, the cost of inaction will mount, and as the report says, Presiding Officer, the challenge is no longer knowing what to do, but when will we act? And with that, I say the time is now, and I hope the Government will agree. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Duncan-Glancy. I now call Murdo Fraser to speak to Amendment 368 in the name of Rachel Hamilton and other amendments in the group. Mr Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm moving Amendment 368 on behalf of Rachel Hamilton, who can't be here in the Chamber this afternoon. Amendment 368 seeks to close a gap in the current law which restricts adaptations such as stair lifts or accessible bathing facilities to a disabled person's main residence. This amendment only applies to cases of unpaid care provided by family members, avoiding ambiguity around issues of paid care or volunteer arrangements. And it would extend rights to cover cases where a disabled person spends significant time in another household for the purpose of receiving care and support from a family member. And the reason this change is important is because the current system does not reflect the reality of modern family life. Many disabled adults split their time across more than one home, perhaps between parents who are now separated, or between their own home and that of a carer with whom they sometimes stay. And without provision for adaptations in both residences, their independence, safety and dignity are compromised. So what this amendment seeks to do in summary is ensure our housing system is fairer, more inclusive and better aligned with the needs of disabled people and their families. And I'm pleased to move Amendment 368.
Thank you. I call Megan Gallagher to speak to Amendment 369 and other amendments in the group. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to say that the Scottish Conservatives, if all the amendments are pressed this evening, we would support, given the importance of the issues that have been raised. My own Amendment 369 is a probing amendment as through discussions with stakeholders, particularly MND Scotland, I have learned that local authorities do not have a clear definition of accessible housing. My concerns relate to those with accessible needs being allocated a house through social waiting lists, only to find that the property is completely unsuitable for their needs. For example, there is one local authority within their own accessible homes definition that defines an accessible home as a property that has up to 4 steps for access. Well, if you are wheelchair bound, this will not be a property that is accessible without adaptations made to the property, and that's why I welcome the amendments that have been brought forward by Pam Duncan-Glancy, who has rightly referenced the report that should offer more clarity in relation to definitions and more clarity in relation to accessibility. But again, that needs to be directed from the government. And again, the reason that we're debating this evening is because that has not happened. There's too many people, Presiding Officer, waiting for adaptations. And again, I learned through discussions with MND Scotland that in some circumstances, people living with MND are waiting up to a year for adaptations to their home. For those that know MND, the MND disease well, in terms of the outcomes and in terms of how people are able to live within their means throughout the rest of their lives, they need the adaptations as quickly as possible. They can't afford to wait years for adaptations to take place. And that's why I do believe that it is imperative for the Scottish Government to strengthen the definition of accessible housing to ensure that councils are fulfilling their duties to provide suitable homes for people with additional housing needs. And I'll leave my remarks there. Thank you.
Thank you. And I call Jeremy Balfour briefly.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I welcome all these amendments in this grouping, and will be supporting them all. And I'm pleased that Pam Duncan-Glancy has had positive negotiations with the Cabinet Secretary. I wonder if I could just make two very brief points. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary, when she is summing up her comments, could confirm that when we talk about accessible housing, we're not just talking about accessibility for those who have wheelchairs, but accessibility goes for people who have hidden disability and other forms of disability as well. Too often I have constituents come to me who will be told they can put a ramp in or they can do this or that for wheelchair. And that is really important. But others who perhaps have less visible disabilities also need adaptations for their housing. And so I'd be interested to make sure that the Cabinet Secretary is picking up on all forms of disability, both hidden and visible. Can I also welcome the amendments in my names in regard to the whole question of adaptation houses? I think we have to be honest, there is simply not enough money going into this budget for local authorities to do this work. And as we just heard from Megan Gallagher, there is often a very long waiting list for people waiting to have these done. This can really affect someone's mental health as well as their physical disability. If they are unable to do things for themselves that with a little help they could do, it often can lead to mental health issues and not being able to use the house to a full facility. Can I again ask the Cabinet Secretary that when we're looking at adaptation, we're not just looking at putting a ramp in, but we're looking at all disabilities to make sure that they are covered. I do hope that these amendments, if moved, will be accepted by the Parliament, because this is a massive issue for many disabled people across the whole of our country. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. And I call the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, as regards Amendment 351 from Pam Duncan-Glancy, I absolutely support the intention being to ensure the accessibility and adaptability of Scotland's homes, and I also recognise the urgency of this work. And I'm really pleased to have heard today cross-party support for a commitment to introduce a Scottish accessible homes standard. Unfortunately, as Ms Glancy narrated, significant drafting errors in her amendment meant I couldn't support it. We discussed this and she understood, and she spoke to some of the detail of that in her contribution. But we did work together on an alternative manuscript amendment, which, had it been accepted, I would have backed wholeheartedly. Despite this, I can assure Ms Duncan-Glancy that I remain committed to introducing a Scottish accessible home standard through building standards and guidance that addresses the accessibility, adaptability and usability of Scotland's new homes. I would want this to be developed in consultation with the building sector as well as other stakeholders, including, crucially, and most of all, those with lived experience. This will help to ensure that any new building standards and guidance are meaningful and proportionate, with the aim to make sure that all new homes are accessible and adaptable to current and future needs or lifelong changing needs. Following consultation with the sector and including disabled persons, I would want this to be, I would want provision to be in place within 2 years, which reflects the discussion that we had, and I'm very happy to put that on the record today. And I will be keen to engage with Ms Duncan Glancy on it. Equally, in respect of Mr Balfour's question, I would want to confirm to him that I will make sure that when we're talking about the needs of disabled individuals, this is the full spectrum of requirements, so he needn't be concerned that any hidden disabilities would be missed. As regards 352, again, I'm fully supportive of the principle, and I'm clear that disabled people must be supported to live safely and independently in their own home, regardless of their housing circumstances. However, this is a similar provision whereby the law already exists for this purpose. I'm not, therefore, agreeable to layering further law atop what already exists, but what I want to do is work with members to make the existing law work better. If it is the case that I will in a moment, I just finish the point to say that if it is the case that the law as it stands isn't working, I'm very interested to work out how we change that, and I'll take Duncan Glancy.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that intervention, and I'm afraid it is the case that the current legislation isn't working, and that has been the conclusion of the report from Stirling University, which is why indeed I brought this particular amendment. They've highlighted various different ways in which the law should be improved in this space, including the improvements that Amendment 352 tried to make. On that basis, would the Cabinet Secretary reconsider supporting this amendment?
Cabinet Secretary.
I take on board everything that Pam Duncan Glancy puts to me. The principle, though, for my inability to accept the amendment doesn't change, in that I don't want to confuse the legal landscape. But what I will do is absolutely take on board what she's telling me about the workability of the existing law, and I will commit to undertake a review of the current housing adaptation system, which will be able to make recommendations building on some of the work that she has spoken to about how we best improve and streamline the system and better target resources. Because there is a lot of resources being spent on this, but if it's not being spent well, we need to work on that. And I'll take Mr Stewart.
Briefly, Kevin Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving way, and I welcome what she has said there about a review, because sometimes the system itself is cluttered with local authorities, health and social care partnerships and the NHS often looking over a fragmented system. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary would agree in terms of that review also a bringing together of all partners to get this right for people across Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, absolutely. I wholeheartedly back what Mr Stewart is saying there about the complexity of the existing landscape and the need to bring partners together to understand what needs to be done. And I'm very happy to commit to Parliament that review will start later this year, and I'll engage members on it. It's also worth, whilst we're discussing adaptations, just to note that we're continuing to support RSLs to adapt their properties appropriately, and the budget for this programme for 25-26 has more than doubled to £20.9 million, of course reflecting our commitment to support social landlords to deliver necessary adaptations. Presiding Officer, I just have a couple of other amendments to address with members. Rachel Hamilton is not here, but her Amendment 368 was spoken to about provision for support of disabled people who require adaptation. Section 73 requires assistance to be provided in cases where the property is the only or main residence of the disabled person. We accept that, but further assistance may also be provided in certain circumstances, and this is currently at the discretion of the local authority. And as I've mentioned and as we've discussed, we've committed to undertake that review of current housing adaptations. So I'll make sure that these issues are raised under that work. I can't support Megan Gallagher's Amendment 369. I understand her intent, and I'm sure it's inadvertent because this is not what she had intended. I fear this might be a step back. Under the current law, adaptations can simply be for the purpose of improving access. But this amendment would mean that works had to be to allow for safe, convenient and unassisted access throughout. So that's a slight step back. I know that's not what Ms. Yes, of course.
Briefly, Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and to the Cabinet Secretary for giving way. Again, this was a probing amendment, so we could talk about the definitions and the need for clarity surrounding definitions of accessible housing. I think it's really important that the Scottish Government take this away in terms of the discussion and the debate that we've had this evening. I'm glad that a review will be underway, but the Cabinet Secretary must look at the definitions of the 32 local authorities, because right now they are inconsistent, and that leaves a lot of uncertainty for disabled families right up and down the country.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. And I know Ms Gallagher, I think she's confirmed she won't be pressing that if it was a probing amendment. I'll conclude my remarks there, Presiding Officer, by again reiterating my commitment to the review and starting that work later this year, and indeed to an accessible home standard within 2 years.
Thank you. I call Pam Duncan-Glancy to wind up. Press to withdraw Amendment 351. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And on the basis of the commitments that the Cabinet Secretary has given and on the drafting concerns, which I would not want the amendment only to apply at the point, for example, that the house was purchased rather than built. So on that basis, I won't press Amendment 351, and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's commitment to take action in this area, particularly with disabled people, their organisations and others, within 2 years. On Amendment 352? Thank you. On Amendment 352, I'm afraid I don't accept the Government's response that a review is needed. One of the things the report from Stirling Uni notes is that evidence on the case for change is consistent, and indeed the need for consistency and equity has been recommended 14 times since 2000, for a strategic approach 21 times, and for partnership approaches 19 times. The time for review really is over. The time to act on adaptations is now, and so on that basis I will be pressing Amendment 352.
Just to confirm, you're seeking to withdraw Amendment 351.
Forgive me, Presiding Officer, I seek to withdraw Amendment 351.
Okay, Pam Duncan-Glancy is seeking to withdraw Amendment 351. Does any member object? No member objects. Therefore, Amendment 351 is withdrawn. I call Amendment 352 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with Amendment 351. Ms Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
The question is that Amendment 352 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is now closed. The result of the vote on Amendment 352 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy is yes 47, no 61. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We move to Group 26, Taxes and Local Government Finance. Call Amendment 353 in the name of Ross Greer. Group with amendments as shown in the groupings. I point out that if Amendment 231 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 359 as a result of preemption. So Ross Greer to move Amendment 353 and speak to all amendments in the group. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, we've saved the best for almost last. Who doesn't want to be discussing council tax reform with me on a Tuesday evening? I'm really glad that colleagues in the Finance Committee have made it back in time from Lithuania for this. Amendment 353 mandates ministers to regulate to undertake a property revaluation for council tax. It's an issue that we debated at stage 2 when I moved a different but related amendment, and I've raised it in a number of other settings, so I won't rehearse all of it now, but suffice to say it is absurd that we all pay council tax based on property values that we know are wrong and 34 years out of date. Every party has recognised that our council tax system needs to change, regardless of what long-term reform looks like. We need accurate property values as a starting point for that reform process. So this amendment has been revised from stage 2 to make clear that ministers can make further regulations to not implement the revaluation if they do not wish to do so. What this would do, though, is it would produce that data set. It would give us a data set on which to base future decisions about reform without committing us to any particular course of action, because I recognise the range of views across Parliament on where we should go in terms of that reform. But I think we can all recognise the need to actually have the data to base those decisions on. Amendments 354 and 355 have the effect of letting councils increase council tax on second and empty homes. I'm grateful to the Government for working with me on these. In 2023, we regulated to let councils impose a 100% surcharge if they wish to on these properties, and it worked. In 1 year, there were 2,500 fewer second homes in Scotland, and this recognises the particular harm that's caused by the huge growth in holiday homes in rural and island communities in particular. On Arran, in my region, communities like Lumlash are now approaching the point where a majority of homes are either second homes or short-term lets. In other areas, like parts of Skye and Westeros, they are already well past half. This is destroying communities. I and other members spoke in detail about the impact it's having on communities in my members' business debate before summer recess, so I won't repeat all of that here. But this amendment builds on what the Local Government Committee agreed to at stage 2, lifting the 100% cap for the surcharge, so effectively the 200% overall cap on council tax, and allowing for council tax to be more than doubled on these second and empty properties. These amendments complete the process by giving councils themselves the power to increase the surcharge rather than leaving it entirely up to Government and Parliament. But it also allows ministers to produce binding guidance as to how that is applied, so they can set sensible exemptions for situations like locum GP housing. I would have hoped that that wouldn't have been necessary, but unfortunately the behaviour of a couple of councils has, I think, merited it. Amendment 356 makes clear beyond a doubt that ministers can write off the council tax debts of those who are experiencing or have survived domestic abuse, where through joint and several liability they are liable for the debts of their abuser. I was glad to get the Government's support at stage 2 for my amendment, which is now at section 51B of the bill, that will lead to a review on the scale of this debt and how we can address it. I'm hoping that following that review, ministers will be writing off that frankly repugnant debt. Survivors should never have to pay off their abusers' debts. Amendment 245 and 246 from the Cabinet Secretary changed the time limit for the review that the committee agreed to at stage 2 from 6 months to a year after royal assent. I'm happy to agree to that. Amendment 357 changes the prescription or write-off period for council tax arrears. Right now, under the Prescription and Limitation Act of 1973, Scottish council tax debts are chased for 20 years, despite the fact most other types of debt here are written off after 5, and council tax debt in England is written off after 6 years. I've raised this twice in the last month with the First Minister, so again I won't rehearse those arguments in full, but briefly, people who have been unable to pay off their debts after 5 years of enforcement action are almost certainly struggling. Sending sheriff's officers to their door over and over again is not helping anyone. It costs councils a fortune in enforcement costs for the little that they're able to recover, and it has knock-on costs. For example, when those who are trying to pay off their council tax debts are then unable to pay their rent, end up homeless, and the council then needs to find them housing. As Aberlour have detailed in their research and campaigning, the current system isn't working for anyone, not those who are in debt and certainly not for councils. That's why I'm proposing that council tax debts be moved to the 5-year limit, which already applies to many other forms of debt to the state. Amendment 358, along with 386, mandates ministers to use their existing powers to rewrite the current regulations governing how councils collect this council tax debt. It would give everyone the right to pay council tax on a monthly basis. It's not currently a right that we have. Right now, if someone falls behind on council tax by just a month or two, maybe due to a sudden change in their personal finances, the council can make them liable for paying the full annual balance for that financial year. So councils are regularly making things worse for those who are struggling by demanding these massive upfront payments, often thousands of pounds, at the exact point where they can least afford it. 359 requires ministers, when doing the review into short-term let accommodation secured by Rachel Hamilton at stage 2, to consider the cut-off point at which a property goes from being liable for council tax to non-domestic rates. Right now, Scotland is well behind Wales on this. There, a property has to be available for 252 days and let out for 182 days in a year to move from council tax to NDR. In Scotland, it's just 140 and 70 days, respectively. If we match the Welsh dates, we'd have more short-term lets paying the second second home council tax surcharge and fewer paying no tax through qualifying for 100% NDR relief. Given the impact of short-term lets on housing supply everywhere from here in the centre of Edinburgh to Arran, I don't think we should be making it easier for them to reduce their tax contribution. 361 ends the current relief from land and buildings transaction tax for foreign militaries. In short, if President Trump's military wishes to buy property in Scotland, they should pay their taxes like everyone else. On a similar note, 362 ends the Crown's exemption from LBTT in Scotland for residential property. It's absurd that one particular billionaire gets a personal tax break. If my constituents need to pay LBTT when they're buying a property, I think the King should too. And Amendment 363 allows ministers to impose a surcharge when companies are buying up residential property. Right now, as the Act is drafted, we can only set one rate, which serves as both the additional dwelling supplement for individuals and the company's surcharge. I want to separate those two surcharges to allow for greater targeting. Right now in England, the stamp duty surcharge on companies is 17%, while in Scotland, because it's tied to the additional dwelling supplement, it's just 8%. So like council tax debt collection rules, this is one area where the law in England is far more progressive than in Scotland, and I think we should fix that. 364, I'm almost done, Presiding Officer, allows ministers to impose a surcharge on overseas buyers of additional property. To be clear, it does not apply to people who are looking to move here and to live here. It would apply largely to the super rich who are buying up homes here either for holidaying or for property speculation. The growing overseas ownership of Scottish land and property is a scandal that this Parliament should get to grips with. 365 allows ministers to impose an LBTT surcharge on the purchase of second and holiday homes in areas of linguistic significance. So we all acknowledge during the passage of the Languages Bill that the biggest threat to Gaelic-speaking communities is the rural housing crisis. The key driver of that is second and holiday home ownership. So making it that bit more expensive to buy a second home in some of our most fragile communities would be an important tool for protecting Gaelic. I will finish there, Presiding Officer. I hope the Cabinet Secretary will respond positively to these proposals to fix elements of our property tax system that are, frankly, currently rigged against ordinary people and in favour of the wealthy few.
Thank you. Just to point out that if Amendment 251 rather than 231 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendment 359 due to the preemption. With that, I call the Cabinet Secretary to speak to Amendment 245 and other amendments in the group. Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Mr Greer's contribution has demonstrated, there are rather a lot of amendments in this group. I'll try and be as quick as I can. It is our penultimate group, however, so hopefully you'll afford me a little time to give members the courtesy of a response. I'll start with amendments in my name, however, 245 and 246. These are about extending the time frame for completing the review of the impact of a joint and several liability for council tax arrears in domestic abuse to 12 months after royal assent, and this is just to make sure that we can gather the necessary evidence and consult properly with stakeholders. Now, generally in this group, some of the amendments, as we've heard, they propose to make changes to LBTT. Now, this would normally be taken forward in a tax-specific piece of legislation, with any proposed changes expected to follow focused taxpayer and stakeholder consultation. It would also normally involve collaborative working with Revenue Scotland to ensure effective administration and compliance, and then be considered by the relevant committee. Bringing them forward at this stage and of a housing bill is far from the right approach. With that said, Amendment 113 from Ms Burgess amends, her amendments 113 and 144 were previously considered at stage 2. Now, existing LBTT arrangements provide relief to those cooperatives who are registered as a social landlord with the Scottish Housing Regulator or that operate as registered charities, but the exemption proposed would mean that transactions do not have to be notified at all to Revenue Scotland. This presents a clear compliance risk, and therefore I can't support it. Amendment 360 in requiring ministers to publish a report on LBTT in the context of housing cooperatives and other community-led housing models. I think this is best considered in the context of the government's broader position on such housing models, rather than considering tax on this matter in isolation. And again, I have to talk back to my leading position, which is about the need for consultation and preparation for any changes in tax. Amendments 353 on a full council tax re-evaluation. The Government can't support this amendment. Whilst there is broad agreement on the need for council tax reform, there are different views on how that should be taken forward, and this is precisely why the Government, working with COSLA, has launched a programme of engagement to build consensus. Firstly, I do have to point out there's elements of this amendment which appear to be without legal effect, as they purport to rely on a provision which can only be used to change tax bandings. But the much more important point is that an independent report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies will be shortly published, which will provide robust analysis of market trends and options for reform. This will be followed by formal consultation with town hall events across Scotland, leading to a debate in Parliament in early 2026. And this will allow us to test illustrative proposals openly and be evidence-led, and we must allow that work to continue. On Amendments 354 and 355, we worked closely with COSLA to deliver the first council tax premium on second homes from April 24, and of course in our 25 PFG we committed to go further by removing the remaining constraints, and this amendment delivers on that, so I'm pleased to have worked with Mr Greer on it and to support it. Regarding Amendment 356, we recognise that joint and several liability for council tax can create very difficult circumstances for those who are or have experienced abuse. That's why at stage 2 we supported the amendment requiring a review of how council tax arrears in this situation are affecting individuals. Mr Greer spoke to that. The outcome of that review will be reported to Parliament and will give us a much clearer understanding. And I don't want to preempt the outcome of that review, because I want to make sure that this provision works, because the experience of victims and survivors is very important to me. I do have a huge amount to get to, but yes, absolutely.
Ross Greer, briefly.
I'm hoping that this will save us time in a moment, Presiding Officer. I'm happy not to press that particular amendment if the Cabinet Secretary can confirm that the Government's intention here, the intended outcome, is that survivors are never put in the position of having to pay off their abusers' debts.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I absolutely support the contention that, that victims and survivors should not be liable for abusers' debts, absolutely. But all I'm saying is that I will await the work that we've committed to being done before committing to an approach in primary legislation. I think that's a sensible approach. Now, on Ross Greer's Amendment 357 on the prescriptive period for council tax debt, I think the most important thing to highlight to the Chamber is that the 5-year period that's mooted could be reset when recovery action is taken or whenever there's an acknowledgement of the debt. I suspect that probably wasn't Mr Greer's intention, because I understand his principled position that 20 years is too long, 5 years is more appropriate. I expect he probably didn't intend that it could reset and go on beyond 5 years. However, on the generality, I am very sympathetic to the points raised on this amendment, to the need to be considerate of what long-term debt feels like for those who are experiencing it and the impact it can have on families. However, this stage in this bill is not the right place to do it, and we ought to have really close consultation, including with local authorities, on what we might do, not least to make sure that we can get the prescriptive period right and make sure it's as fair as possible. Moving to 361, seeking to restrict the exemption from... Yes, I will.
Briefly, Ross Greer.
I'm grateful, and again, I'm happy not to press this amendment if the Cabinet Secretary could perhaps confirm that the kind of further consultation that the Government believes is required will now be undertaken. And again, if she could just perhaps echo what the First Minister said last week, where he appeared to agree on the point of principle that the current rules around council tax debt are not working for struggling families and that some kind of reform is necessary. If the Government agrees on that point of principle and that consultation will happen, I'm happy not to press this, because that would be sufficient progress for me.
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, like the First Minister said at First Minister's questions last week, the Government is very sympathetic to the inherent unfairness in the current system and to considering how it could be improved. My point is that we need to do that work to consider it, Presiding Officer, and importantly to consult with those affected. Moving to 361, seeking to restrict the exemption from LBTT for the purchases of military headquarters and barracks by overseas visiting forces. The introduction of this relief was considered necessary as a consequence of UK international treaty obligations and NATO agreements. Most importantly, however, On the basis of Defence and International Relations reservations under the Scotland Act, the removal of this exemption is likely to be outside parliamentary competence, and I can't support it. Amendment 362 on Crown application of the LBTT Act. Firstly, this introduces some ambiguity into the LBTT framework by referring to residential property transactions, but it's not clear if it's intended to apply in the case of mixed-use or linked transactions. But most importantly, it is important for matters of tax to be clear and not to be introduced at stage 3 of a bill where difficulties in drafting can't be overcome. So I can't support that one. On Amendments 363 and 365, members will be aware that the ADS is set at a flat rate of 8% in addition to core rates of LBTT. 363 and 365 would allow for a significant divergence from existing arrangements and long-standing policy and would require thorough consultation to explore the case for change. Likewise, on Amendments 364, the arrangements for a broadly similar provision in the UK stamp duty land tax regime indicates that this is a highly complex proposition. Detailed consultation, including with Revenue Scotland, would be essential before any legislation relating to a surcharge could be considered. Moving as quickly as I can, Presiding Officer. Amendment 247 in the name of Graham Simpson is defective. It appears to be based on an out-of-date version of the relevant order, and I can't accept it for those reasons. I'm not sure if Rachel Hamilton is here and if someone else is going to speak to her Amendment 376 on the visitor levy, but under Section 75 of the 2024 Act, there's already an existing requirement on ministers to review the operation of the Act and to prepare a report before Parliament. I'm not prepared to duplicate that work unnecessarily. Equally, the effect of Amendment 377 is that revenues generated could be put into general housing funds as opposed to what the visitor levy was intended to be for, namely for tourism, and therefore I can't support that amendment either. Amendments 250 to 254. During stage 2, it was explained that the intention of this section of the bill, section 51E, was to require a review of the processes around the classification of self-catering holiday accommodation in particular. The evaluation of all non-domestic property, including the classification of properties on the roll, is a matter for the independent Scottish assessors. For self-catering accommodation, properties assessors determine whether the requirements to be classified as self-catering holiday accommodation liable for non-domestic rates are met in any given year. And we are considering whether further changes are needed going forward, but the current wording of Section 51E is very broad. A wide range of property types would potentially be captured within the scope, and, for instance, hotels, guest houses, caravans and timeshares are all potentially suitable for providing housing. Amendments 250 to 254 in my name will deliver the intention but provide greater clarity in doing so, namely that the scope of the review is the process around the classification of self-catering holiday accommodation for the purposes of non-domestic rates. And it will also make clear that the review must include the manner in which any such determination be communicated. Amendment 359 by Ross Greer would require the review of the classification of properties under Section 51E to include within its scope the number of days per year for which a residential property has to be available for let and the manner that it's to be let. The valuation of all non-domestic property, including the classification of properties on the roll, as I've said, is a matter for Scottish assessors. On a technical point, whilst Amendment 359 refers to days, the units of measurement for these requirements change to nights, with effect from 1 April 2024. More generally, I would point back to Amendments 250 to 254 in my name, which provide greater clarity and a better scope. I therefore encourage members to oppose 250 to 254. Amendments 248 and 249 in my name seek to merge the two provisions of the bill relating to housing revenue account of local authorities into a single section. And with that, I shall leave it there, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call Graham Simpson to speak to Amendment 247 and other amendments in the group. Mr Simpson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendment 247 is an issue that I raised at stage 2, and it's I did so because it's been raised with me by students themselves. And it's basically the requirement to start paying council tax after finishing a course and actually between that and graduating. So this amendment seeks to exempt people from having to do that. Now, the Cabinet Secretary alludes to drafting errors. That's the first I've heard of it, but I'll accept what she says. But I think there's actually a wider issue, which I've discussed with her, and that is that there could be actually quite a gap between someone finishing a course and actually graduating, and some people might not actually get round to graduating. So for those reasons, I won't be pressing this amendment. Well, yes, I can, yeah, but I had finished addressing it.
Can I just ask, what would happen under the circumstance where a person actually defers graduating for a year, maybe so they graduate with their friends? Would they be exempt from paying council tax for all that time?
Graham Simpson.
Unfortunately, Mr Lumsden didn't appear to have heard what I was saying. I'm not going to be pressing this amendment because it has problems with it, probably exactly the sort of problems that he's alluded to. Now, this group has allowed Ross Greer to re-rehearse the arguments he put forward at stage 2 on reforming council tax, and he knew then, as he knows now, that while there's great merit at looking at council tax reform, it really needs separate legislation. And he knows that, and it's the same with amendments on LBTT. It needs proper consultation. This has gone into the too difficult box for too long. I accept that. I'm pleased to hear the Cabinet Secretary say that there could be a debate in this Parliament in early 2026. That would be a good thing, but this legislation isn't the place for it. Ross Greer knows that, but at least he's got a press release out of it.
Call Ariane Burgess to speak to Amendment 114 and other amendments in the group. Ms Burgess.
Housing co-ops play an important role in Scotland's housing landscape, and it's vital that we support them. In my amendments 113, housing cooperatives relief from additional dwelling supplement would remove the ADS burden from all housing co-ops, not just those that are registered as charities or social landlords, while Amendment 114 exempt transactions, housing cooperatives would exempt them from land and buildings transaction tax. The bulk of housing co-ops in Scotland are not registered social landlords or charities. This is often because of the way that they're set up or run, or the purpose that they serve prevents them from having either status. For example, Edinburgh Student Housing Co-op can't be a social landlord or charity, but enables students from low-income backgrounds to secure affordable housing in what is a challenging housing market, a significant public good. Both of my amendments contain strict rules co-ops must meet if they are to get exemptions, and these are contained under subsection 3. Key points to note here are that only tenants or those who are soon to move into a co-op are allowed to make decisions about how the co-op is run. And likewise, my definition is careful to state that shares and share capital aren't beholden to market forces that make other types of housing so unaffordable. The idea is that anyone can live in a co-op regardless of their economic background or stage of life, but those that do so can't abuse their share of a co-op for their own gain. The wealth created through members' contributions is held collectively, reinvested in homes and the community, and passed on to future members. The whole concept is a purely democratic model. Co-ops redistribute wealth away from speculative individual gain and into secure, affordable housing for the many. These robust stipulations have been drafted with the support of the Confederation of Cooperative Housing and Cooperatives UK, as well as individual housing co-ops across Scotland. When I meet these organisations, they always say that LBTT and ADS are the biggest barriers to the co-op sector in Scotland, and these taxes make it harder for co-ops to get started and meet demand. This matters because this model should have a big role to play in tackling our housing emergency. It offers an affordable option between renting and owning that takes pressure off local authorities and individual budgets. It also locks in collective wealth. Instead of rent payments leaving the community, they circulate back into improving homes, strengthening the co-op and supporting long-term affordability. Likewise, the model offers social benefits that can lead to positive health and well-being outcomes, taking pressure off public services. In short, co-ops are vital if Scotland is serious about the community wealth building agenda and tackling the housing emergency. Frustratingly, England is ahead of Scotland in this area. South of the border, co-ops get a form of relief from stamp duty, despite working under a weaker legal definition than the one I'm proposing today. And this allows them to operate effectively in extremely challenging housing markets like London. By passing these amendments today, we can change this and significantly improve housing outcomes for people all over Scotland. My Amendment 360 is a backup amendment to these two amendments, which would require the Scottish Government to produce a report on the impact of LBTT and ADS and what that impact has on co-ops and community-led housing sector. It will enable the Government to see for itself that there is a real need for these reliefs to be applied to the housing co-op model. As I've already set out, co-ops are crucial if we are to tackle the housing emergency. Providing them with appropriate reliefs would allow them to play more of a role in providing housing for people of all backgrounds. Through collective power, these people can provide affordable, quality housing for all without the need for much taxpayer support. And they do need government facilitation if they are to become more strongly established and expand. The SNP recognised this during the Bute House government, and it was a stated aim of that administration that it would seek to support cooperative housing and consider LBTT relief. It's beyond time for this scoping exercise to happen, and if the government is serious about community wealth building and tackling the housing emergency, it must act.
Thank you. Just a reminder to colleagues to either take their conversations outside or keep them much quieter. I call Murdo Fraser to speak to Amendment 376 on behalf of Rachel Hamilton and other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Amendments 376 and 377 in the name of my colleague Rachel Hamilton are essentially probing amendments to try and determine the impact of the visitor levy on housing and indeed other aspects on the economy. And it's curious, I think, that we haven't seen a full economic impact assessment of the impact the visitor levy is likely to have. And not surprisingly, there is widespread concern across the tourist sector, but also wider economy representatives about what the impact of the visitor levy is likely to be. And we in this side of the chamber have consistently warned of the impact the visitor levy is likely to have, and we've been joined in that by many industry representatives. Just last week we saw a chaotic and shambolic situation where the Minister for Public Finance announced one day that the government was prepared to consider changes. We're going to bring forward changes to the visitor levy, and 3 days later corrected himself and said they were only going to consider that. And not surprising, this has caused a great deal of uncertainty and dismay in the tourist sector. Earlier this year, over 80 organisations from across the hospitality and tourist sector issued a stark warning that without urgent changes, the visitor levy scheme would, in their words, cause harm to both Scotland's economy and individual businesses. So we see right now different councils, including here in Edinburgh, bringing forward plans for a visitor levy. At the same time, we don't know what the future of the levy will be, whether the government will bring forward changes, when those changes will be, and what the impact of those might amount to. So our call is that there should be a moratorium on the visitor levy until we see how this resolves itself. That is in the interests of Scottish business before more damage is done, Presiding Officer. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of brief contributions. First from Willie Rennie.
I just want to praise the indefatigability of Ross Greer for forever pursuing the reform of council tax. He's starry-eyed optimist when he comes and talks about this issue, but quite rightly so, because he has pursued it in many cases the same way as Liberal Democrats, but to no avail, because we have seen repeated working groups, joint working groups, cross-party task forces, commissions, citizens' assemblies, roadshows, debates, endless barriers to actually doing anything at all to reform the council tax. We will be voting for some of his amendments today to try and make that point. But the most important thing is that if the government's words are not to be hollow, then they actually need to come forward with proposals themselves, rather than hiding behind processes forevermore. So that's my appeal to the government, is get off the fence.
And Mark Griffin. We have Mr Griffin's microphone.
Thank you, President Officer. To speak briefly and broadly to the package of amendments that Ross Greer has tabled for debate today. Now, there is a lot in there when it comes to additional dwelling supplement, land and buildings transaction tax and wide-ranging reform of council tax and debt. When you look at some of the individual amendments, absolutely agree with the policy behind them, specifically on debt, areas around debt and on victim survivors of domestic abuse paying for their abusers' arrears. Absolutely on board with the direction of travel with Mr Greer there. What I have an issue with is when you take them as a collective, the cumulative impact of that entire package of council tax and LBTT reform. It seems like that has been done in a vacuum almost. I didn't hear any reference to working with Revenue Scotland. I didn't hear reference to any dialogue with COSLA or local authorities. It seems to have been done in a vacuum without consideration of the Verity House agreement. And so it's for those reasons that I think that this bill in itself isn't the place to tackle these issues that absolutely deserve consideration in a bill of their own. But in saying that, I fundamentally agree with the individual points on some of those amendments that Mr Greer is making. Just the cumulative impact of all of those is so wide-ranging, such a huge package of reform that I think they need detailed consideration of their own.
Thank you. I call on Ross Greer to wind up. Press to withdraw Amendment 353. Mr Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I will not revise the arguments around every amendment here. I just want to make a couple of observations, particularly around the Cabinet Secretary's points and some of what Mark Griffin's just said about, and Graeme Simpson as well, that this is not the right bill or the right stage. I think on the point around this not being the right stage, having introduced these too late from the Cabinet Secretary, with respect, I've got to say that that was bordering on disingenuous, given that almost all of this was brought at stage 2, that I did discuss it with her predecessors. These are issues that I've discussed with the government, specifically in relation to this bill, for months, but as well as Rennie pointed out, many of us have been discussing and trying to get progress on for years, and in some cases, decades. And I actually agree that this is not the ideal bill through which to bring forward many of these amendments, that they should be brought forward as part of dedicated tax legislation. But my response to the Cabinet Secretary on that specific point is that the government should then bring forward that tax legislation, or indeed a wider finance bill, as indeed members from either end of the political spectrum in this place have argued for a long time. An annual finance bill alongside the budget would allow us to resolve many of these issues. So it is not a particularly compelling point from the government to say that you've not brought these forward for the right bill, when the government has not brought forward the right bill in the first place for members to use as a vehicle. I don't think the government should blame other members for taking advantage of this bill to fix issues that the government itself has not done. For example, the area where we have come to agreement around lifting the cap on council tax surcharges for second and empty homes was something that the Scottish Government committed to do, I think, about 3 years ago, but then said there was no legislative vehicle for in the remainder of this session. Well, we have proven that that was not the case, and I'm glad that we've been able to agree on that. But I really want to pick up, in particular, on Willie Rennie's point around all the barriers that have been put up in the way for 34 years on fixing the council tax, a system that was supposed to be a quick and dirty and temporary replacement for the poll tax, but that has now been out of date for longer than I have been alive. The Scottish Government has led substantive processes on this before, and this is where I struggle to trust the government on this point in particular, where they say that we need to take this forward through the new reform process that they've recently announced and are now embarking on. Well, 10 years ago, the government launched the Commission on Local Tax Reform, a substantive piece of work that they then barely acted on, to the extent that when I asked the government for a copy of the report, they discovered that the domain had expired and they needed to use the Internet Archive, the Wayback Machine, to recover these critical documents. I think it is particularly unfair of the government to talk about drafting issues here. In particular, I don't think that drafting is the reason why they're not supporting my amendment to end the King's personal tax break. I think it would be helpful if the Cabinet Secretary had just laid out the Scottish Government's position on principle on these issues. That being said, though, I am glad that we are making progress on some of this. So there's a range of these. There are some that I'm going to press, including the first one in this group, Presiding Officer, but I won't press all of them. I am frustrated, though, that so many of these issues could have been resolved if the government had spent the summer engaging with me on the issues that they apparently agree in principle on and are only now coming up with drafting reasons to vote against.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 353 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Keith Brown.
I was unable to connect. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Brown. I'll make sure that is recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 353 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 12, no 95. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 354 in the name of Ross Greer. Already debated with amendment 353. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Move.
Question is that amendment 354 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Result of the vote on amendment 3. The result of the vote on amendment 354 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 75, no 31. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. Call amendment 355 in the name of Ross Greer. Already debated with amendment 353. Ross Greer to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that amendment 355 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote's now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 355 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 78, no 30. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. Call Amendment 245 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 353. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 245 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Craig Hoy. Point of order, Craig Hoy.
Apologies, Deputy Presiding Officer, that point of order actually related to the prior vote.
The result of the vote on Amendment 245 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is yes 84, no 26. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call Amendment 246 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 353. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 246 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Point of order, Joe Fitzpatrick. Can you repeat that, Mr Fitzpatrick?
Sorry, I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Fitzpatrick. I'll make sure that is recorded. The result of the vote on Amendment 246 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is yes 83, no 26. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call Amendment 247 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with Amendment 353. Graham Simpson, to move or not move?
That's not moved.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 356 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move? That is not moved. I call Amendment 357 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 358 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. I call Amendments 248, 249 and 250, all in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, all previously debated with Amendment 353. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 248 to 250 en bloc.
Moved en bloc.
Does any member object to single questions being put on Amendments 248 to 250? No members object. Therefore, the question is that amendments 248 to 250 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 251 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated with Amendment 353. I would remind members that if Amendment 251 is agreed, I cannot call Amendment 359 due to the preemption. Cabinet Secretary to move formally. Thank you. The question is that Amendment 251 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. I call Amendment 252, 253 and 254 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and all previously debated with Amendment 353. I invite the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendments 252 to 254 en bloc. Thank you. Does any member object to a single question be put on Amendments 252 to 254? No. The question is therefore that Amendments 252 to 254 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. Call Amendment 114 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 353. Ariane Burgess to move or not move?
Moved.
Question is Amendment 114 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 114 in the name of Ariane Burgess is yes 21, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 113 in the name of Ariane Burgess. Already debated with Amendment 353. Ariane Burgess to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 113 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 113 in the name of Ariane Burgess is yes 30, no 79. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 360 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 353. Ariane Burgess to move or not?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 360 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote's now closed. Result of the vote on Amendment 360 in the name of Ariane Burgess is yes 21, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Call Amendment 361 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. To call Amendment 362 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
Question is that Amendment 362 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is now closed. Result of the vote on Amendment 362 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 10, no 97. There were 2 abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. Call Amendment 363 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 364 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
That is not moved. To call Amendment 365 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 365 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. And the vote is now closed. Result of the vote on Amendment 365 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 8, no 101. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 366 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 112. Mark Griffin, to move or not move? Moved. Question is Amendment 366 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 366 in the name of Mark Griffin is yes 83, no 25. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. Call Amendment 255 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 112. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 256 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 112. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that Amendment 256 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. Vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 256 in the name of Maggie Chapman is yes 45, no 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 21 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 112. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
That is not moved. I call Amendment 367 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 112. Mark Griffin to move or not move?
Moved.
Question is that Amendment 367 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. That is agreed. Call Amendment 115 in the name of Paul Sweeney, already debated with Amendment 3. Paul Sweeney to move or not move? That is moved. Question is that Amendment 115 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament's not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. Vote is now closed. And the result of the vote on Amendment 15 in the name of Paul Sweeney is yes 21, no 88. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed, which takes us to Group 27, Antisocial Behaviour Register of Tenants. I call Amendment 257 in the name of Edward Mountain, in a group of its own, Edward Mountain, to move and speak to Amendment 257. Mr Mountain.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and I would just like to remind the Chamber in my register of interest that I am a landlord in Murray. I let houses under PRTs, I let tied properties, and I've been letting houses for 30 years. I am indeed a qualified surveyor, and I was also letting houses for people...
Mr Mountain, if you give me could we have a little less noise around the chamber, please? Mr Mountain, please resume.
I'm sure it's bubbling excitement, Presiding Officer, for my amendment. Well, one of the reasons why bringing this amendment is not, as I suspect some members to believe, to protect the landlords in the private rented sector who have been described as wolves and weasel word users. This is about trying to protect people who let houses, and especially in the social sector. My mailbox is often full of complaints of people who are living in social houses next to people whose antisocial behaviour prevents them from living in their houses in a way that they can enjoy them. So therefore, the point of this amendment is to allow the government to draw up a register of those antisocial people, those people with antisocial behaviour, so that people are aware of the tenant that they're taking on. Now, this is particularly important, Presiding Officer, in my mind, so that they know when they are, say, in social housing, putting up somebody who has convictions for drug use or drug provision, that they don't put them next to people who are susceptible or trying to go clean or making a break from drugs. That is one of the reasons why this amendment is there. And it allows the government to make a register, and they can dictate how the register is kept, how the information is specified in the Sorry, Presiding Officer.
Yeah, I would be grateful if any conversations could be drawn to a close.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Sorry, I want to take interventions if I'm allowed to. It's somewhat difficult for me. My hearing aids have run out of battery. I'm struggling to hear to take the intervention. So if I could just get through this as quickly as possible, because I know time is against me. But it would allow the government to suggest how to amend an entry and how to enforce a register. Now, one wonders whether that's fair. I think it is fair because landlords have to be registered and they have to enter in on a register and they have to renew every 3 years under government legislation, and they can be removed from that register if they're not regarded as a suitable landlord. And if they can't prove that they're a suitable landlord and they're removed, they can't advertise the property and then they can't let the property. So there are severe restrictions on landlords, and I welcome those. I think it weeds out landlords who aren't being good landlords, and I think that therefore it's only fair that if we're controlling landlords that the register is kept to the tenant so everyone knows the tenant they're taking on and if they're going to come with problems. That is the premise of my amendment, and I'd be delighted to hear the Cabinet Secretary's reasons why she's supporting it. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I have listened very carefully to Edward Mountain. However, my reflections remain that this is a significant proposal with very wide-reaching implications. And whilst I hear what he's saying about his aims to support housing providers ultimately manage risk, it is a significant new and untested policy for which I understand there's been no previous discussion or consultation. Moreover, some of this information that is being sought would already be available to landlords. But beyond that, I have concerns regarding the proportionality of an approach which requires this register as set out. I will in a moment, yes, but I think it raises understandable concerns about fairness, privacy, rehabilitation, particularly rehabilitation, given that I don't think there's any time limit set for how long a person would remain on the register, and I'll take the intervention.
And I thank the Cabinet Secretary to taking an intervention. I wonder where she could point me to that allows landlords to ascertain whether their tenants, proposed tenants, have behaved antisocially in the past. On several occasions, it would be that my amendment would suggest that would be needed to be known. I can't find it, Cabinet Secretary.
Cabinet Secretary.
I only mentioned, Presiding Officer, that some of the information, not all of it, but some of it is already available to landlords. But I would just reiterate that point about proportionality, fairness, privacy and rehabilitation. I ultimately want an inclusive, rights-based approach to housing policy, and I don't want to create indefinite barriers for people to access social homes.
Thank you. I call Edward Mountain to wind up and press or withdraw Amendment 257.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I listened to the Cabinet Secretary and I listened to the Cabinet Secretary's intervention that some of the information should be available. She actually gave me no indication of where some of that information could be found. And I don't think my amendment in any way is seeking to prevent people getting houses. It's just to allow people to understand what what tenant is moving in the same way that the tenant has an absolute right to know what sort of landlord they're moving, i.e. is a fit, or he or she is a fit and proper person because they're on the landlord's register. I am disappointed the government aren't going to support this because I worded this amendment in such a way, and I'm glad the Cabinet Secretary didn't say that it was poorly worded, but I worded this amendment in such a way that the Scottish ministers had as much ability to amend how that register would be kept, but just asking them to keep the register. So I do press the amendment, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for half giving me an answer to my questions.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 257 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 257 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 28, no 82. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 368 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, already debated with amendment 351. Murdo Fraser, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 368 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 368 in the name of Rachel Hamilton is yes 46, no 61. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 369 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with amendment 351. Megan Gallagher, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. The amendment is not moved. I call amendment 370 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with amendment 123. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 370 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Shirley Ann Somerville for a point of order.
Just checking if I've recorded my vote as a no.
I'll just check, Ms Somerville. I can confirm it was recorded. Thank you. I call Edward Mountain for a point of order.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, I couldn't get my device to connect. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Mr Mountain. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 370 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy is yes 23, no 86. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 371 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with amendment 123. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 371 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 371 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy is yes 47, no 63. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 372 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 123. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 373 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 123. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 373 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 373 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 45, no 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 374 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 123. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that amendment 374 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 374 in the name of Ross Greer is yes 45, no 64. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 375 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with amendment 3. Megan Gallagher, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. Amendment is not moved. I call amendment 376 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, already debated with amendment 353. Murdo Fraser, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 377 in the name of Rachel Hamilton, already debated with amendment 353. Murdo Fraser, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. And I call amendment 258 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with amendment 123. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. And the question is that amendment 258 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 258 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 47, no 62. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 259 in the name of Jamie Halcrow-Johnston, already debated with amendment 3. Megan Gallagher, to move or not move?
Moved.
Oh. My apologies. Mr Halcrow-Johnston is with us. Jamie Halcrow-Johnston, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 259 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 259 in the name of Jamie Halcrow-Johnston is yes 38, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 260 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 112. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 39 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 139. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 40 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 139. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 262 in the name of Emma Roddick, already debated with amendment 139. Emma Roddick, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 262 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The amendment is agreed. I call amendment 263 in the name of Graham Simpson, already debated with amendment 139. Graham Simpson, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 22 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 1. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 264 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 4. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 266 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 79. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Also not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 265 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 79. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 50 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 79. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 378 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 79. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 379 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 45. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Can't break this streak. Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 116 in the name of Pam Duncan-Glancy, already debated with amendment 123. Pam Duncan-Glancy, to move or not move?
Not moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I call amendment 380 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with amendment 3. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 381 in the name of Ariane Burgess, already debated with Amendment 3. Ariane Burgess, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 382 in the name of Edward Mountain, already debated with Amendment 306. Edward Mountain, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 382 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 382 in the name of Edward Mountain is yes 45, no 64. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call Amendment 383 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 306. Mark Griffin, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 385 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 306. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 384 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 306. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move? Thank you. I call Amendment 48 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 339. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 49 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 339. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 261 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 112. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 387 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with Amendment 112. Mark Griffin, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. And the question is that Amendment 387 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call Amendment 386 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with Amendment 353. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call Amendment 51 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with Amendment 112. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call Amendment 117 in the name of Paul Sweeney, already debated with Amendment 3. Paul Sweeney, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that Amendment 117 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Shirley Ann Somerville for a point of order.
No.
Oh, 117 is no.
Well, apologies, it's just shown up that it did register, Presiding Officer. Apologies.
Thank you, Ms Somerville. The result of the vote on amendment number 117 in the name of Paul Sweeney is yes 45, no 64. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 388 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 123. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 389 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 123. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 390 in the name of Ross Greer, already debated with amendment 123. Ross Greer, to move or not move?
Not move.
Thank you. I call amendment 118 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 1. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 23 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 1. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 119 in the name of Jeremy Balfour, already debated with amendment 306. Jeremy Balfour, to move or not move?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 119 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. I call Richard Leonard for a point of order.
My app wouldn't connect. I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Leonard. We'll ensure that's recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 119 in the name of Jeremy Balfour is yes 17, no 91. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 24 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 1. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 25 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 79. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 120 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 1. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 391 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with amendment 45, I should say. Mark Griffin, to move or not move? Thank you. I call amendment 392 in the name of Mark Griffin, already debated with amendment 45. Mark Griffin, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 26 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 9. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 27 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 9. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 267 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated with amendment 138. Maggie Chapman, to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 267 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 267 in the name of Maggie Chapman is yes 22, no 88. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 28 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 3. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. I call amendment 29 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 3. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 41 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 152. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 42 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 152. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 43 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 152. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Not moved.
I call amendment 121 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated, with amendment 152. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 121 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call amendment 268 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 138. And I remind members that if the amendment 268 is agreed to, I cannot call amendment 122 due to a preemption. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 268 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 268 in the name of Maggie Chapman is yes 22, no 87. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 122 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, already debated, with amendment 138. Cabinet Secretary to move formally.
Moved.
Thank you. The question is that amendment 122 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 122 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary is yes 101, no 8. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. I call amendment 269 in the name of Maggie Chapman, already debated, with amendment 138. Maggie Chapman to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that amendment 269 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 269 in the name of Maggie Chapman is yes 8, no 100. There was one abstention. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And I call amendment 393 in the name of Megan Gallagher, already debated with amendment 139. Megan Gallagher, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that amendment 393 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their votes now. The vote is closed. The result of the vote on amendment number 393 in the name of Megan Gallagher is yes 39, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And that ends Stage 3 consideration of amendments. As members will be aware, I am required under standing orders to decide whether or not, in my view, any provision of a bill relates to a protected subject matter. That is, whether it modifies the electoral system and franchise for Scottish parliamentary elections. And in the case of this bill, in my view, no provision of the Housing Scotland Bill relates to a protected subject matter. Therefore, the bill does not require a supermajority to be passed at Stage 3. And before we move to the debate, I call on the Cabinet Secretary to signify Crown consent to the bill.
Presiding Officer, for the purposes of Rule 911 of the Standing Orders, I advise the Parliament that His Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the Housing Scotland Bill, has consented to place his prerogative and interests, insofar as they are affected by the bill, at the disposal of the Parliament for the purposes of the bill.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And we move on to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion 18992 in the name of Mary McCallan on the Housing Scotland Bill at Stage 3. I'd be grateful if members who wish to speak in the debate were to press their request to speak buttons. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary to speak to and move the motion.
Presiding Officer, I am absolutely delighted to finally begin this last aspect of the Housing Scotland Bill with a debate at Stage 3. This has been a long and thorough process. And before turning to the substance of what this groundbreaking bill will provide, I should like to offer some acknowledgements. Firstly, to members across the Chamber for their rigour in scrutinising the bill, and in particular the members of the Local Government, Housing and Planning, Social Justice and Social Security and the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committees, all of whom have taken a keen interest in the bill. I want to extend significant thanks to all the experts who gave evidence to committee and who worked with the Scottish Government to help shape the contents of this ambitious piece of work. I also want to acknowledge former Ministers Patrick Harvey and Paul McLennan, as well as the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, Shirley-Ann Somerville, all of whom have contributed at one time or another to this momentous piece of work. My thanks also go to the Scottish Government Bill team, who have worked incredibly hard on the bill's policies, as well as closely considering the policy purpose and the legal effect and advising ministers on the implications of over 1,000 amendments. Their commitment to the service of Scotland has been abundantly clear throughout, and I want to thank them, as well as my private office, who have helped me pull everything together, including the bill folder, which I have been carrying around for quite some time now. Finally, and most importantly, I want to thank everybody with lived experience of homelessness or housing precarity whose advocacy will now help to change the law in Scotland in a very significant way. And it's on that note that I should like to turn to focus on just some of what this bill provides that the Government is particularly proud of. And I'd like to begin with Ask and Act, Presiding Officer. We believe that everyone in Scotland should have the opportunity of a warm, safe and affordable place to call home. It is ultimately the cornerstone of a life of dignity and a life of opportunity. And homelessness is not a one-off event. It is trauma, it is stigma, it is indignity, and it deprives people of the opportunity to live well, to succeed and to contribute fulsomely in society. It must be ended, and we know that the best way to end homelessness is to prevent it from happening to people in the first place. And that's what our groundbreaking Ask and Act powers seek to ensure. They will sit atop Scotland's already highly protective legal landscape and will ensure that ending homelessness is ultimately everyone's business. Police officers, community link workers, social care staff, health visitors and social landlords are among those who will be expected to identify problems early and intervene if they believe someone is threatened with homelessness. It's person-centred, it is flexible, it is responsive, and it will help to prevent the trauma and the stigma of homelessness. And I mentioned the importance that the Government places on lived experience. Allow me to share with the Chamber a quote from a former service user who was quoted by Advice Direct Scotland in September this year. They said that, having experienced homelessness myself, I know how vital it is that people, regardless of their place in life, feel seen, heard and supported with no judgment or feeling of shame. Ask and Act is a call to every frontline worker in Scotland to recognise the signs, to ask with compassion and act with purpose. The right question at the right time can change the course of a life. And changing a course of a life is what this Government seeks, with the First Minister's core objective for our Government being to eradicate child poverty in this country. The provisions of this big bill that we have been considering, together with the Housing Emergency Action Plan published at the beginning of this month, they will help to serve that purpose. And I hope that Parliament will vote for this bill, offering as it does, offering as was put to us by lived experience and quoted by Advice Direct Scotland. It's giving us the chance to change the course of a life. This bill does so much, Presiding Officer, across a broad range of topics, and in the time that I have, I just want to touch on a couple more. Coming to post, I have been determined to do what I can to ensure that no one, and especially no child in Scotland, has to live in a tenanted property with damp and mould. That's why we've been clear that AWAB's law will be implemented in Scotland, and it will be implemented across the social and private rented sectors. Now, my officials have already begun the series of roundtable discussions with stakeholders, which will help to bring AWAB's law into place from March next year. Just by way of background, AWAB's law is named after Awab Ishak, who died in 2020 in Rochdale in England, having been exposed to mould in his home. Now, while standards in Scotland have been gradually rising to the extent that now 90% of all homes are substantially free from damp and mould in Scotland, we won't take any chances, especially not when it comes to the health and life chances of children. I'm very conscious of time, Presiding Officer, and this bold and ambitious bill does so much that I'd like to mention, but one other area of great importance to me is domestic abuse. It's utterly abhorrent. It is one of the leading causes of homelessness among women, and we must do all we can to end it. That includes supporting the housing needs of women and children who are experiencing domestic abuse. And among other things, this bill will create new rights to end a joint tenancy without an abusive joint tenant's approval. I've also confirmed I'll work to lay regulations on Part 2 of the Domestic Abuse Act by Christmas to ensure that a victim survivor in a social home can stay in their home and can remove a perpetrator of abuse. The bill will also require social landlords to implement policies to ensure that abuse or violence from a partner or former partner does not lead to somebody losing their home, and that sits alongside a national fund to leave backed by £1 million that the Government confirmed at the beginning of this month. Now, I've only been able to touch on 3 aspects of this groundbreaking bill in opening, Presiding Officer. I haven't yet been able to explore the system of long-term, evidence-based and balanced rent controls that this bill will create. nor the important rights to personalise a home. But what I will do is I will listen to members' contributions and I'll reflect on these other areas in closing. But in the meantime, I commend the Housing Scotland Bill to the Chamber and move that Parliament agree that it be passed.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call Megan Gallagher up to 6 minutes. Ms Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Housing remains central to many of the challenges facing our communities. Our homes are the bricks and mortar that binds local cohesion. Access to good quality housing should be the driving factor for us all. Sadly, the reality is record high homelessness figures, thousands of children in temporary accommodation, unsustainable waiting lists, local authorities buckling under the pressure, a skills shortage and a declining housing sector. The Housing Bill was born out of a pact the SNP government made with the Scottish Greens, and at that time the government did not understand the consequences of far-left policies, a bill that could potentially devastate the housing market. And I will admit on that point that there has been some movement in this space, an attempt at the last hour to hand an olive branch to investors and the private rented sector. But at its core, this is a housing bill that proposes permanent rent controls and does not include a single line about building homes. That is a housing bill that is too broad in scope and a bill that should have been named the Tenants' Rights and Homelessness Prevention Bill. When we're looking at rent controls, it is a misguided policy. It's reckless, it's ideologically driven, and it could worsen the housing crisis. It could punish tenants, discourage investment and make Scotland a less attractive place to build the homes that we so desperately need. And I think we need to look at the facts. There were 19,288 homes built in 2024-25, down 4% on the previous year. And in the social sector, completions were at the lowest since 2016-17, with 4,490 completions, down 15%. To reach the 110,000 affordable homes target by 2032, the Scottish Government needs to build around 10,000 homes a year, but they only achieved this once since 2021 and only built 7,444 in 2024-25. These figures are far below the figures that experts say Scotland needs annually to meet demand. We know that developers and housing providers operate in a market that requires certainty. If returns are capped permanently, if revenue streams are constrained, then the very incentive to build disappears. It is a simple economic fact. Rent controls do not create homes, they prevent them. And to compound the issue, damaging rent controls have already cost Scotland £3.2 billion in lost investment. That is the scale of the damage that's being wrought on the industry. And when the fewer homes are built, tenants will suffer the consequences. Competition for available properties intensifies, prices rise in uncontrollable sectors, and homelessness continues to grow. And this is not an abstract argument. In 2024-25, 17,240 households in Scotland were in temporary accommodation. And shockingly, 10,360 of them were children. In 2024-25, there were a record of 31,695 open homelessness applications. In these numbers, every single person that make up that 31,695 is a heartbreaking story that's behind them. They represent families who cannot find a safe roof over their head, children who are moved from place to place, and vulnerable adults living in uncertainty. And I think we've got to remind ourselves in this chamber that policies that we make, that we create, have consequences. I've said already, people desperately need homes. People on long waiting lists need hope, and they need politicians to understand the gravity of the crisis, not policies that are potentially going to worsen the housing emergency for ideological reasons. The housing crisis is further compounded by a significant skills shortage in the construction sector. Scotland faces a gap of thousands of skilled tradespeople, bricklayers, joiners, plumbers and electricians. Industry reports show that over 20% of construction firms struggle to recruit the skilled workers they need. That's not merely an inconvenience, it's a barrier to delivering new homes. These are the issues that should have been in this housing bill. These are the issues that we should have been debating tonight. But if I can touch upon the economic consequences of rent controls, because they are equally stark to what is being experienced within our skills sector. Research from multiple jurisdictions, including studies in London and parts of the United States, consistently show that strict rent caps reduce investment in new housing. Developers delay projects, projects are cancelled and fewer homes come onto the market. We can't afford this. Scotland needs investment, not deterrence. We need ambition. We don't need artificial constraints. Furthermore, we also must recognise the immense pressure on our local authorities. In an environment of year-on-year declining budgets, councils are struggling to maintain existing housing stock, fund homelessness services and invest in new builds. Rising inflation, once again on the move, increases the cost of materials, wages and borrowing. This combination of pressures will inevitably reduce the number of homes that can be delivered. And I think we do need to look at affordable housing. We've spoken many times in this chamber about the affordable housing budget and the consequences that this has also had on local government. Presiding Officer, we can't in good conscience vote for a bill that's going to harm the possibilities of building more homes that people desperately need and at the rate that they need to be built. I do thank the Cabinet Secretary, both Shirley-Anne Somerville and Mary McCallan, for the productive conversations during Stage 2 and Stage 3. This is clearly a difference in what we believe will tackle the housing emergency. But I hope that they will reflect on this bill. It's been too broad and it doesn't address the housing emergency that's a priority for Scotland. Thank you.
I now call Mark Griffin up to 5 minutes. Mr Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. There are absolutely positive things in this bill, but let's be clear, this is a housing bill that doesn't build a single house. It doesn't bring a single new home into circulation. It won't bring immediate reductions in rent, and it doesn't give local authorities the resources they need to prevent homelessness. But I support this bill because, like I said, there are important improvements in it. But we all know that it could and should have gone so much further in the context of a housing emergency and a severe shortage of housing supply. But I am pleased that the Government accepted several of our amendments, including one that finally recognises in law that Scotland is in a housing emergency. We also secured improvements to factoring legislation and strengthened the bill's provisions on damp and mould through what's now been called Awab's Law. And we welcome the commitment to review the current grounds for eviction, which is long overdue. But let's be clear, despite the rhetoric, no one will wake up tomorrow and find themselves in a rent control area. No one's rent will go down because the bill has passed. And when it was introduced, there was no detail on what rent controls would actually look like, and that caused more harm than good to efforts to build the homes we so desperately need. But after pressure, we now have a step forward. The bill no longer threatens to harm supply, but make no mistake, this is just a beefed-up version of rent pressure zones, and we all remember how effective those were. We support mid-market rent and build-to-rent as part of a diverse housing mix, but the way these exemptions were introduced late in the process, after a chaotic Stage 2 and a change of minister 2 times over, raises serious questions across government about how that policy was made and drafted in the first place. Now, including these sectors initially seriously risked housing supply, and I'm not sure why it took so long to clarify the government's position on exemptions when the government knew about the concerns on mid-market rent. They knew that was an issue from as long as 3 years ago when we debated the emergency cost of living legislation. But, Presiding Officer, as we finish our third day of consideration of this bill, 10,180 children are living in temporary accommodation. More than 40,000 families are homeless, and rough sleeping is on the rise. Now, we might grumble about the policy process in this bill, and I think we've got valid complaints, but we can't forget fundamentally why we're considering and voting for this law. There are families, children and individuals out there who are being failed in horrendous ways by a system that is stretched to breaking point, and that's why we welcome, in particular, the bill's focus on homelessness prevention, particularly the new Ask and Act duty on public bodies. But I have to say these duties will only work if local authorities are properly resourced, and the Government's financial assessment of what it will take to implement specifically the Ask and Act and prevention duties, I feel, Presiding Officer, is wildly optimistic. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that the money that goes to local authorities will be enough to cover the costs of a proper, adequately resourced prevention system that stems the flow of people into the homelessness services that are at breaking point. Presiding Officer, we will support this bill because it does contain improvements on the current system, but it's not the transformative legislation that Scotland's housing crisis demands. We want to build houses, we want to end homelessness, we want rent controls that work not just in theory but in practice without harming supply. Now, this bill is a step forward, but it's a very small step forward. We wish it was a more radical one that we could vote for, but in any case we'll be voting for it at decision time. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Maggie Chapman up to 4 minutes. Ms Chapman.
Thank you. New Year's Day 1989, a day of celebration for some, but for many, the first of almost 40 years of runaway rip-off rents. Margaret Thatcher's Housing Act swept away rent controls, and working people have paid the price ever since. Since 2010, rents for a two-bedroom flat in Lothian have increased by 104%, 82% in Glasgow. But renters' wages haven't gone up by anything like those amounts. So what has happened? Well, exactly what that Maggie intended. A massive transfer of wealth from the poorest to those lucky enough to own property. But owning an asset is not an occupation. A basic human right to live in a warm, safe home has become a platform for profiteering. Today, Scotland rejoins the ranks of the many countries around the world that use rent controls to support affordable living. I am so proud that it was Greens that introduced this bill, and that I am another Maggie in the team making it stronger and bringing back rent controls. This bill and the rent controls it introduces is the first stage of the New Deal for tenants that the Scottish Greens promised. Renters will know that their rents should never increase by more than 6%. It will give them certainty and help them plan their finances and lives better. And where rent notices are higher than they should be, renters can challenge them, with more time to do so, thanks to the Greens. But the system will not be as strong as it might be. The bill locks in above-inflation rent increases without considering renters' ability to pay. Parliament rejected my proposals for rent freezes and rent cuts, and has opened the door to a range of exemptions. We should not build a two-tier system of protections where some tenants are shielded and others left to the mercy of the market. All renters deserve the same stability, no matter what roof they live under. But I am pleased that we are improving the evictions process, including more scope for delays during the winter months, though the outright winter ban that Greens proposed would have been better. No one should live with the threat of eviction at a moment's notice, and I remain disappointed that Scottish renters won't have the same protections as English renters for the first 12 months of their tenancy. If properly funded and implemented, the duty for public bodies to prevent homelessness, to step in when risk is first identified rather than when it's too late, is a potential game changer. Housing First is another. Giving homeless people with complex needs a long-term stable home and offering, but not forcing on them, health and other support services is tried and tested. And if this bill takes us closer to removing the cruel concept of intentional homelessness, that will benefit so many. Allowing someone to be assessed as intentionally homeless is a moral disgrace. Actions that might seem intentional often stem from trauma, violence and disadvantage. It is right that we've made it easier for animal lovers who rent to keep pets and make appropriate adjustments so everyone can feel at home. Whilst the introduction of AWAB's law is significant, there is still so much to do to drive up the quality of rented homes. But to conclude, Presiding Officer, we are in the grip of a housing emergency, not because we lack resources or capacity, but because for 4 decades of policies, we've prioritised profit over people. Those who are homeless because of exploding rents, those fighting for dignity in a system stacked against them. Housing instability crushes a person's spirit. It steals hope, it erodes dignity, and it worsens inequality. We must not create another generation resigned to paying too much for too little. Instead, we must create a future where everyone can say, I have a home, and I am safe, and I am respected. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I now call Willie Rennie. Up to 4 minutes, Mr Rennie.
First of all, I want to praise the clerks and the officials for their talent, I think their tolerance of this Parliament, and also their stamina, because the stamina has been outstanding through the months that it felt like of stage 2 and the years that it felt like for stage 3. But I just want to, I think, the Chamber to show their appreciation for the... We'll vote for the bill. It's not the bill that we would have introduced, nor would we have gone through this process, which I think has knocked confidence in the sector at various stages. But it is a better bill, and it's a bill worth voting for. But we are in a housing emergency, and it's really disappointing that it's taken a housing emergency for housing to get the priority that I think it's deserved for a very long time. But we've got that priority now, which I think should start to see some changes so that we can deal with that housing emergency. I mean, just this very day, Homes for Scotland have told us that the new starts across all sectors is the lowest since 1996. We've got a long way to go to build confidence in the sector. And we do need every part of the sector, the housing sector, it should be seen as one sector, to play its part to deal with the housing emergency. And those who seek to demonise parts of it, I think, are undermining the very objectives that we're trying to achieve. Because we do need the private sector, all those house builders who battle away through the various barriers at different times to build houses in communities that they care about. They want to deal with the housing emergency and they want to be partners, and I think we should welcome them to be partners, just like the public sector and charities. They will help us through this difficulty and we should welcome their help. This is a delicate balance. It's a delicate balance between making sure that tenants have got the rights that they deserve, the homes that they need, and the family homes that they need. But we also need to do everything we possibly can to incentivise investment, and we've been pretty poor at that in recent years. There is still quite a bit of work to be done. The exemptions, which I hope are as generous as we can possibly make them, to incentivise that investment on MMR, on build-to-rent, but also on investment by landlords, significant investment. There should be measures to exempt them so they can get a return on that investment. Otherwise, we'll find that we're not getting the appropriate investment in all properties, which is the thing that we desperately need. We need to do an awful lot of work on planning. Planning is still seen in many areas as a barrier. I know Ivan McKee is working hard at trying to overcome those. We need to be working very carefully on the heat and buildings work and also the accessibility measures, because I'm in favour of them, but we just need to make sure we get them right so we incentivise that investment and get the best possible homes that we can have. But most of all, we've got to build confidence, and for that we need stability and certainty, sometimes boring certainty, to make sure that we can give those house builders that certainty so that they can invest for the longer term. We'll vote for this bill because it's got some really good measures on domestic abuse, on homelessness, on an AWAB's law. We'll continue to work constructively with the government, as we have throughout this bill, to make it a better bill. And on that, I commend this bill to the Chamber.
Thank you, Mr Rennie. We move to the open debate. I call first Alistair Allen, to be followed by Edward Mountain. Up to 4 minutes. Dr Allen.
Presiding Officer, as someone who frequently raises the issue of affordable housing in relation to my own constituency, I'm very pleased to speak in support of the housing bill today, as well as the measures set out by the Cabinet Secretary recently in the Government's Housing Action Plan. Housing pressures remain, of course, acute across much of Scotland. The lack of a private rented sector in many rural communities adds to that pressure. Despite significant investment in housing over the SNP's time in government, I think everyone acknowledges that challenges remain across our cities, towns and rural areas. But this bill is tackling those problems head-on, and this primary legislation is useful legislation in achieving those ends. Under the SNP, Scotland is already the fairest place to rent in the UK, and this bill will build on that progress to create a sustainable, well-regulated sector. The Housing Bill, Presiding Officer, is, I believe, an essential piece of legislation which will help advance tenants' rights and tackle homelessness in Scotland. Measures contained in the bill will empower tenants, as we have heard, proactively prevent homelessness and provide certainty to encourage continued investment across the housing sector. The recently published Housing Action Plan outlines nearly £5 billion of investment over the next 4 years and focuses on 3 key areas: ending children living in unsuitable accommodation, supporting the housing needs of vulnerable groups, and supporting growth and investment in the housing sector. Since coming to office in 2007, the SNP government has built 40% more affordable homes per head of population than England over the same period, and 70% more than Labour-run Wales. And this is all against a backdrop of increased costs and challenges as a result of the financial crash historically, Brexit and the pandemic, as well as, of course, the severe limits placed on Scotland's borrowing powers. In my constituency, Presiding Officer, work has begun this year on 12 new social housing units in Leverborough and Harris. And that might not sound like a big number, but to a small community where no social housing has been built for 50 years, this could be the difference between the local care home staying open, a business continuing to be able to operate, or local health services being able to function. The local community council and housing association are to be commended for their efforts in bringing this project to fruition. At the other end of the scale, locally, I can think of the 74-home development at Analdhu outside Stornoway, visited by the First Minister recently. And this is one of a number of larger projects underway to improve access to affordable housing in the islands. It's important that we continue to make that affordable housing investment and make sure that it is made available to all of Scotland's communities. That flexibility ensures that the higher cost per unit of building in more rural communities is not a barrier to progress. And we must also continue to help community organisations and landowners to build affordable homes through tailored support such as the Rural and Islands Housing Fund. Presiding Officer, there remains much work to be done to ensure that everyone in Scotland has a high-quality, long-term and affordable home. But the measures set out in today's bill demonstrate the Scottish Government's commitment to tackling the housing emergency, and I commend the Cabinet Secretary on her ongoing efforts in bringing this bill and the accompanying Housing Action Plan to fruition.
Thank you. I now call Edward Mountain to be followed by Davy Russell. Up to 4 minutes. Mr.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I've struggled with this housing bill because I've wanted to engage with it, and at every level I've tried to engage with it. Presiding Officer, it's proved difficult. During the Stage 2 amendment stage, the committee sat on the very same day that the committee that I'm on sat, and I was unable to get to most meetings. I managed to attend a few occasions to try and bring some amendments forward. And then the amendments that I did manage to bring forward and get debated and agreed at the committee stage then were promptly reversed when it came to Stage 3. That's really hard when you've worked hard on a bill. And I've also found it hard because I've found in this chamber the point that Willie Rennie's made, that all landlords have been tasked or tarred with one brush when it comes to providing rented accommodation. I'm not embarrassed to say I'm a landlord. I'm not embarrassed to say I provide houses, good quality houses, for long-term homes. I don't do short-term lets. But during the course of this session, we've been described landlords as wolves of the private sector, lack of concern by landlords, weasel their way out of things, grotesque and ludicrous rent rights. I have to say that's not something that I recognise in the sector that I've been working in for 30 years. In 99% of the cases, landlords do want to provide a home. They want to have a long-term relationship with their tenants. Long-term relationships with their tenants makes it easier for everyone, and it allows the house to be well looked after, and it allows for the landlord and tenant to make agreement on areas where there may be issues. So I'm really bitterly disappointed when I hear that sort of language in the Parliament relating to landlords. And I would remind the member who used that language, Ms Chapman, presiding officer, who's in here, that I think there are something like 300,000 private rented properties across Scotland, and they do help. However you might view the landlords, they do help in providing homes for individuals who can't afford their own homes. Now, we've made legislation in the past in this Parliament about rent increases, and I think that in most cases that has worked. Presiding officer, I have to also allude to the fact that during the course of this stage, I raised 69 amendments at stage 3. I did it because I thought they were necessary. And to have comments made when it comes to discussing them as unnecessary, not appropriate, not the right approach to take, can't commit today, might talk later, supports the principle but can't agree it, actually makes a mockery of this process. I am in the chamber to try and make the bill better, and I don't think I've managed to do that in any shape or form. I would just say to the Cabinet Secretary that she should remember, in my mind, presiding officer, that if the survey carried out by Safe Deposit Scotland just recently and published this afternoon while we're in here, that 33% of landlords want to get out of letting properties. 33%. That's 100,000 houses that are taken out of the rented sector. And there'll be those in this chamber that argue that they would go into homes and people would be able to buy them. But only 62% of those homes go into private ownership, and not all of them are affordable to those people who need to need to rent properties. If I've got presiding officer, you're saying no. I'm sorry, Cabinet Secretary, I can't. So I just say at this stage, I think this bill doesn't strike the right balance, but for getting it right for the tenant and incentivising landlords to make their properties better and invest in them in the future. There's a huge amount they're going to have to do to reach net zero, and this bill will put them off. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. I now call Davy Russell to be followed by Jeremy Balfour. Up to 4 minutes. Mr Russell.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The big problem with this bill is that from its outset, it looked to address the symptoms that we see in our housing sector rather than address the underlying problems. But we must acknowledge that there will be some relief for those at the sharp end of the rented sector. Clearly, there was too much uncertainty and confusion, loopholes. However, this bill takes a few steps forward in looking at evictions, succession of tenure, rights of pet owners, homelessness, to name but a few, so there are some positive aspects. However, powers to introduce rent control areas, while sometimes necessary, are not sufficient to stem the tide of rising rents that are affecting the bottom end of the market, or for a young family looking to guarantee their future, parents looking to help their child take that big step onto the housing ladder. This bill does nothing. But the bottom line is there is a lack of affordable housing, and that's putting strain on councils and RSLs alike, driving rents up, and it's a key factor in that process. By and large, the most common complaint I receive from constituents is from families stuck in housing that's too small for their family. They might be in their parents' house or grandparents' house. In some cases, they'll leave a child, one of the older children, with the other members of the family. But this bill doesn't solve that, and it should have a plan for that. As I said a couple of weeks ago in the Chamber, Scotland has 250,000 homes with damp, mould and condensation issues. What we have here are amendments that relate to how quickly landlords can fix these issues, when really the bill should have challenged the reason that there are 250 damp and mouldy homes in the first place. I will close on this. Just as the post-First World War council house building was incredibly ambitious for the time, with revolutionary ideas like, although it seems strange nowadays, indoor toilets for the working class, I believe in 2025 this Parliament of this country ought to be equally ambitious. And ambition should start with the idea that everybody can afford to live somewhere warm, safe, dry and energy efficient. This bill combats some of these issues of the housing sector, but not the issues of housing. I will be voting in favour of this bill as a stepping stone towards something better, and I encourage all the members in here to do the same.
Thank you, Mr Russell. I now call Jeremy Balfour to be followed by Graham Simpson. Up to 2 minutes, Mr Balfour.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I start agreeing with Willie Rennie that we should give a big thank you to all the clerks who have worked so hard and helped us with this. Can I also thank the third sector, particularly Crisis, for their very positive engagement over the last number of years. But for me, Presiding Officer, this is a disappointing night, and it's a night of missed opportunities, because this was an opportunity for us to do something really quite radical and quite different around housing and homelessness. And I feel that as we will pass this bill in a few minutes' time, people will look back and see it as a missed opportunity. I cannot vote for this bill tonight for two reasons. Firstly, as a representative of someone here of Edinburgh and Lothian, rent arrears will have a devastating effect on the Edinburgh property market. If we look at the evidence across the world, we know that that is going to be the case, and there's going to be more homelessness and more people struggling to find accommodation because of this measure. But secondly, Presiding Officer, I believe that the work around prevention of homelessness is again a missed opportunity. I, like Mark Griffin, hope that history will prove me wrong. I think Ask and Act could have been so much better, but we're being asked to jump into darkness. We're not having the pilot programmes to know if this will work or not work. And we have no data sharing, we have lack of money, and we have a pressure of the local authorities, third sector and NHF all working against us. This is a missed opportunity. The government should go back and rethink this, and I hope I'm wrong, but I fear I'm not. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Balfour. I now call Graham Simpson again, up to 2 minutes. Mr Simpson.
Thank you. This has been a real marathon, but it's felt like we've run this course before, because we have. Many of the Stage 3 amendments debated over 3 long nights were also debated at Stage 2 and mostly not moved, following promises of talks with the government. Some of those talks took place, some didn't. We've ended up with a bill in which good ideas have been jettisoned and the government has got its own way on everything. The bill is well-intentioned, but is fundamentally flawed. It risks undermining the very goals it claims to pursue: affordable, quality housing and a thriving rental sector. Instead, it introduces sweeping rent controls that will deter investment, reduce housing supply and ultimately hurt the very people it aims to protect. I proposed amendments to help students. None of them made it, not even the one that said councils should include student housing in their local housing strategies. I proposed exempting build-to-rent and mid-market rent properties from ruinous rent controls. Even though the Cabinet Secretary agreed with that, they didn't make it either. We've ended up with a system where those sectors will be exempt through regulations so as not to stifle investment, but the private rented sector won't be. Quite why that won't stifle investment is beyond me, because it will. Rent controls are a blunt instrument. They don't address the root causes of housing unaffordability, which is a chronic lack of supply and planning bottlenecks. And the bill centralises too much power in ministers' hands, leaving key decisions to secondary legislation with limited scrutiny. There are some good measures on homelessness. I want to see AWAB's law. The measures on domestic abuse are good, but I cannot vote for this bill because of the rent control measures, which will be extremely damaging.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. We move to closing speeches, and I call first Ariane Burgess, up to 4 minutes. Ms Burgess.
As we close debate on this bill, let's return to the fundamentals. Who this bill should serve and what we must demand if we are serious about delivering justice in housing. Too often in this chamber and in the media, discussions about housing are dominated by landlords, developers and big finance, and we must recentre our debates so that they reflect the needs of the people and communities who rely on us to speak up for them. The Scottish Greens have always insisted that housing is a human right, not a profit engine. And that's why we've pushed hard for rent controls that have real teeth, tougher standards to improve housing quality for everyone, and rectify the unjust imbalance between the rights of the tenant and those of landlords. The very fact that we have a housing bill in front of us is due to the Scottish Greens, and I wish to thank my colleague Patrick Harvey, who introduced this bill and its key measures whilst serving as a minister. His work is a tangible demonstration of the fact that when you elect Scottish Greens, they get things done, and it offers real progress. It introduces powers for local rent controls to cap annual rent increases in designated areas, and it strengthens rights around repairs and security of tenure. Scottish Green amendments also push the government to make changes in key areas. This bill is a huge step forward for renters, although I'm disappointed that it has been watered down in some areas, and improvements suggested by us in concert with experts like Shelter and Generation Rent have not been passed. The Scottish Greens highlighted how second homes and long-term empty properties must be part of the solution. Unlocking these homes is essential for communities where local people are priced out. And we've been clear we must support community-led housing and cooperative models and provide stronger powers for local authorities to tackle landlord inaction on safety issues like damp and mould. I am concerned about some of the bill's shortcomings. Exemptions risk creating a two-tier rent control system, and above inflation rent rises are still possible. Tenants must wait until 2027 for full protection, even though they need them now. Students risk being abandoned to the wild west of unregulated accommodation, and we need stronger compulsory purchase powers for empty homes. Ross Greer's focus on fairer taxation provided tools to do that. This bill is a test of our values. Will we side with working people and the vulnerable, or with powerful interests? Too many Scots are in despair. Families are struggling with rents, students are in poor quality overpriced housing, and communities are being hollowed out by second homes. And the Scottish Greens have put forward a vision: tenant empowerment, local accountability and community-led housing solutions. I champion tax relief for co-ops to make them viable, and Maggie Chapman warned us not to reinforce inequality, and Ross Greer challenged us to create a more just system. I also wish to thank and recognise the work of MSPs from other parties. Mark Griffin worked diligently on a wide range of issues, including emphasising issues around the housing emergency, and Megan Gallagher brought forward some changes that were also welcome. And I want to share Richard Leonard's concerns of the shameful conditions on the accommodation for agricultural workers. That must be acted on urgently. Renters, families, students, those at risk of homelessness are watching us tonight, and they need us to act with courage and integrity. Let this bill be the beginning, not the end. And let's deliver housing that works for people all over Scotland.
Thank you, Ms Burgess. I now call Pam Duncan-Glancy again, up to 4 minutes. Ms Duncan-Glancy.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and apologies for the interruption when I was looking for a figure on my phone. Clicked on the message with the answer in it and, of course, clicked on a message with sound. So forgive me for that, Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to close today's debate on behalf of Scottish Labour. We've heard numerous times throughout this debate and many others that Scotland is in the midst of a housing emergency. While this terminology is now commonplace, the gravity of the situation cannot be overstated. As my colleague Mark Griffin and Davy Russell have set out, Scottish Labour will support the bill today because it recognises the emergency in law, and it moves forward in some other crucial areas, including on AWAB's law, reviews of evictions grounds and rules on factoring. However, we're clear, though, that this bill is a missed opportunity. It fails to solve the fundamental problem of the lack of housing supply in Scotland, which is desperately needed to end the housing emergency, and the bill doesn't introduce proper and workable rent controls. The reality is that the government has done far too little, far too late, and so homelessness has risen on their watch. Figures released last week lay bare the stark reality of the situation in my region of Glasgow alone. More than 1,000 cases of rough sleeping reported last year, and the overall number of people rough sleeping rising to a record high across the country. Glasgow has seen an 11% increase in people living in temporary accommodation, over 4,000 people, the highest number since 2022. That's over 4,000 people living in Glasgow without somewhere permanent to call home. And furthermore, there's been a 9% increase in homelessness applications. Despite the current situation in Glasgow and across Scotland, the SNP government had cut funding for the Affordable Housing Supply programme in real terms. The bill before us, which we will, of course, as I say, support today, on the basis that I've set out, was an opportunity to change direction of all of that. Nonetheless, there are, of course, some improvements, including those added by my colleagues and I. And can I take the opportunity now to say that I'm pleased the Government were supportive of amendments making it easier for students to end their tenancy in specific circumstances. However, it's disappointing that my proposals on a purpose-built student accommodation charter and strategy were rejected. I'm also disappointed that other crucial amendments, like one supporting women fleeing violence in my colleague Katie Clark's name, or the ones on common buildings insurance from Paul Sweeney that would have protected many residents in Glasgow and elsewhere, or the one in Mark Griffin's name, allowing people to have rent arrears to move to allowing people with rent arrears to move to more suitable accommodation. None of these have made it onto the face of the bill, and that, of course, is a disappointment. I hope the Government will therefore take action in these areas urgently, and we on these benches will continue to press them too. Presiding Officer, I want to mention briefly the experience of disabled people, and I'd like to thank members, including Jeremy Balfour and Megan Gallagher, for support on these issues today. Many disabled people require accessible homes. That means adapting old ones and building accessible new ones. That's why I moved the amendments I did today. I'm pleased the Government is committed to updating building regulations to make provision for accessibility and suitability for disabled people within 2 years of the Act coming into force. This will be welcome news to the tens of thousands of disabled people waiting on housing lists for a home that suits their needs. With 25 years having passed since accessibility standards were reviewed, this is a significant step forward. But there is much more to be done in this space. Adaptations are a key part of that, a truly tangible preventative approach to future-proofing our homes. It's incredibly disappointing that the Government failed to support amendments on that today and instead opted for a review. I think the time for reviews was over and the time to act is now, and I hope the Government will reflect on that. Presiding Officer, as I've already set out, the bill moves some areas forwards, and so we will support it. But as a whole, with no more homes built as a result, in the absence of proper and workable rent controls, and in the face of more reviews, not action, this bill is a missed opportunity to address the housing emergency in Scotland. On such an emergency, the SNP have not met the challenge, and for that reason, we encourage them to go further and faster to end the housing emergency in Scotland. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Ms Duncan Glancy. And I call Alexander Stewart. Up to 5 minutes, Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Happy to close on behalf of the Scottish Conservatives. The bill has had a long and difficult journey from where we find ourselves. 10 months ago, we started at stage 1, and there have been numerous weeks at the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee for stage 2, and stage 3 has taken almost 3 full days of parliamentary business. Despite all that, the time we've spent, the legislation is still not representing and responding to Scotland's housing crisis that we so badly need. And despite all that, we will not see one single home built from this new bill. And it risks also fracturing the hundreds of thousands of privately rented households in Scotland. Many stakeholders have continued to warn that the rent control proposals of this bill are hurting supply within the private rented sector, and that includes from organisations like Scottish Lands Estates and the Scottish Association of Landlords. These benches have raised concerns about these proposals since we first started going back, and we've spoken about examples in other countries, in Sweden and Germany, where rent controls did not see investment and did not see housing properly processed. And the SNP have failed on that experiment that took place in 2022, where rent caps were stopped and the government trying to make these damaging measures permanent. But Seeing, presiding officer, stage 3, the bill has a long time coming, and as I say, it has not contributed to anything. Megan Gallagher spoke about in the debate today that the supply should be driving the house supply, and that's not happening. The bill will see and ensure permanent rent controls, misguided opportunities. It will ensure that investment does not take place and rent controls do not make homes. We'll see fewer houses built, homelessness will continue to grow, and it is a missed opportunity. Councils will struggle to cope, housing benefit will struggle to cope, and it doesn't do anything to help the emergency. Willie Rennie spoke about the stamina, and we've had a huge amount of stamina in stage 2 and stage 3, but it's disappointing what we've achieved. Long way from building confidence within the sector, not what the sector needs. The balance is not there, and planning is still a barrier. What we needed was confidence, stability and security, and we have none of that. Edward Mountain spoke about the way that landlords have been demonised in this whole process and the language that's been used. And the long-term residents and tenants and landlords needs to be looked at to ensure that this bill will be better. And in reality, this bill will not make things better. It will ensure that there is still inequalities. And Edward spoke about 33% of landlords wanting to no longer continue into the business. That's not the balance we want to see. That's not the balance that we wanted for this. Presiding officer, in the debate, we've heard about the narrative that pitches tenants against landlords. As I've said, that's not the influence that we want, and that's not the narrative that we need to hear and has been proposed in the bill. Despite the Butte House Agreement ending over a year ago, the SNP appear to have fallen for the narrative, hook, line and sinker, to ensure that rent controls are there. It's the time for the narrative to be talked about. We need much more to be involved in the situation so that we can see increases and we can attempt to move the housing supply forward, which we've tried to do. This bill was an opportunity to realise that and to deal with the housing emergency. It has not been that, presiding officer. It has catastrophically failed to achieve what was set out. It's a missed opportunity, and this bill will risk making the housing crisis even worse. And for those reasons, we will certainly not support the bill this evening at decision time. Thank you, presiding officer.
I would discourage the front bench from repeatedly heckling in that way. I now call Manny McCallan to wind up the debate. Cabinet Secretary, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, presiding officer. Well, after that lively contribution from the other side of the chamber, I would like to begin on a point of consensus, acknowledging the considerable cross-party support that we have managed to foster on this bill. And we ought to be proud of it because it hasn't always been the case. And we have been on a journey with certain aspects of the bill, but I have been speaking very regularly with housing stakeholders recently, and among the many things that they have remarked to me is how pleased they are to see politicians across the chamber working together, not least on some of the very important exemptions from rent control that we have agreed today. And on that point of consensus, I want to particularly acknowledge Willie Rennie's contribution, agree with him about much of what he observed, and ultimately thank him for his considered approach and his support. And I also want to acknowledge something that Alistair Allen said, because in a landscape of statistics and much strain in the system, we can get caught up in requiring a significant shift in the numbers. But what Alistair Allen pointed out to us, that even comparatively small developments of affordable homes can be transformational in communities, and that, among many other things, is what the government's affordable home supply programme is supporting. Now, I'm very pleased that Labour, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens have confirmed they will vote for the bill tonight. I am frankly astonished that the Conservatives have taken the position that they have, that they won't support the bill. I think it's utterly appalling, if I am honest. I want to be clear to them that what they are voting against is what somebody with lived experience of the indignity and the trauma of homelessness described as the chance to change the course of a life. I absolutely will.
Megan Gallagher.
I'm actually astonished that the Cabinet Secretary's made that statement, if I'm being perfectly frank, because if you look at what I've said, if you look at what the Scottish Conservatives have said this evening, is that we are principally opposed to rent controls. That is what we are against. I have said within my contribution that this bill isn't a housing bill. This bill is a renters' rights and homelessness prevention bill. Now, if the Government had embarked on this track, they might have had much more success, but we cannot and we will not vote for a bill that doesn't tackle the housing emergency. We cannot and we will not vote for a bill that will stifle investment, but it looks as though that's what the Government's priorities are.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, however much Megan Gallagher tries to explain it away, the Conservatives have completely undermined any remote credibility they had on impacting on homelessness.
Let's hear one another.
And on dealing with the housing emergency. We won't let them forget it, Presiding Officer, and nor will the people of Scotland. And Megan Gallagher, in her commentary there, mentioned the bill won't build houses. Mark Griffin echoed this to an extent. Let me tell them what will build houses, and that is the Housing Emergency Action Plan that just 4 weeks ago the Government published, with up to nearly £5 billion of investment in the coming years, enough to build 8,000 affordable homes this financial year alone, and up to 36,000 affordable homes over the next 4 years. Now, just 4 weeks ago we published that. Today, I hope we will vote for a bill which will prevent homelessness in the first place, that will protect tenants from damp and mould, that will support the housing needs of women suffering domestic abuse, that will create rights for tenants to end their tenancies, to personalise their homes, and create a system of evidence-based rent controls. And just on this, I'm afraid the characterisation of rent controls by both ends of the chamber is a little skewed and inaccurate. On the one hand, the Conservatives have to acknowledge the severe strain that tenants face when their rents become uncontrollable and begin to rise and escalate in an uncontrollable way. That feeds homelessness from the private rented sector. On the other hand, I'm afraid I do have to appeal to Green colleagues to see that care and balance that I have been talking about, that Willie Rennie has been talking about, that is absolutely critical to our housing system. And these exemptions that I began by talking about, Presiding Officer, are therefore very important, and what the Government has presented here responds to the needs of tenants struggling with escalating rents, but equally provides confidence and ensures investment in our housing system that will ultimately increase availability and therefore availability. And just in closing, Presiding Officer, I was asked recently what a home meant to me.
Cabinet Secretary, I think it's fair that this debate has been carried on over days in a very courteous environment. I'd be grateful if we could carry that through to the end. Cabinet Secretary.
I am just coming to an end, and I realise it's been a long session for everybody, but I was asked recently what a home meant to me, and I answered fairly off the cuff that it was about safety, relaxation, a place to spend time with family. But it reminded me, actually, because I've been thinking about it since, about something that I used to do when I was when I was training as a lawyer, and I was travelling early in the morning trying to get to work before the partners, although that never worked. And it was always dark, and I would just sit and rest my head against the bus or the train window and look at all the houses that I was passing. And some of them would be in darkness and the family were still asleep. And some of them would have a little sign of life, a smoking chimney, and others would have a little glowing light. And to me, that's what a home is. It's that little burning light against a dark, cold morning. And that's exactly what the Government want to be an opportunity and to be available to everybody in Scotland. And through a combination of this bill and our Housing Emergency Action Plan, we are absolutely providing that to the people of Scotland.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on Housing Scotland Bill at stage 3. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is an announcement by the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee on instruments considered during the first quarter of the parliamentary year 2025 to 26. I call on Stuart McMillan, convener of the committee, to make the announcement.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful for the opportunity to make this announcement on behalf of the Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee regarding a recent report on the Scottish statutory instruments laid between mid-May and the start of this month. This is an unprecedented step for our committee to seek to highlight one of our reports which look at the quality of the instruments, but we felt that the issues that we have recently identified merited being raised in the Chamber, which we hope will spur an improvement from the Scottish Government. Our role is unique. We consider all subordinate legislation laid before this Parliament, and as the report lays out, there has been a marked decline in the quality of instruments that were laid before the Parliament in the first quarter of this parliamentary year. This change is identifiable in three main ways. Firstly, and perhaps most prominently, the number of instruments that have been reported on under the reporting grounds laid out in Rule 10.3.1 of the Standing Orders has increased to 28%. To contextualise this figure, the next highest percentage of instruments drawn to the attention of the Parliament in a quarter of this session was 14%, or half the figure from the most recent report, and more typically, the percentage figure is between 5 and 10%. Secondly, the number of reporting grounds engaged by individual instruments has also increased. While a typical instrument may be reported on one or occasionally at two grounds, we have had multiple instances of several reports being made for one instrument. And across just 6 instruments this quarter, there were 30 reports, including one SSI laid with 8 reportable issues. Now, these errors have been identified across several policy areas and so are of note to all in this chamber. Finally, the number of the instruments drawn to the attention of the Parliament this quarter have engaged serious reporting grounds, with 4 issues reported for the drafting appearing to be defective. So the Scottish Government has committed to correcting many of these errors, which is to be welcomed. However, that they are happening so often now is a cause for concern to the committee. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee encouraged the Scottish Government to work to improve the overall quality of instruments laid before the Parliament, and hope to see the number of issues reported fall back for the rest of the session and into the next. Thank you.
Thank you, Convener. It's now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of Parliamentary Bureau Motion 19135 on committee membership, and I ask Graham Day, on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, to move the motion.
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Minister. The question on this motion will be put at decision time, and there are 2 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion 18992, in the name of Mary McCallan, on the Housing Scotland Bill at stage 3 be agreed. And as this is a motion to pass the bill, the question must be divided by division. I'd be grateful if members who have been voting throughout the afternoon were to refresh their screens.